He was born on a night when the sky pretended to be simple, when the lamps of the constellations seemed to hold their breath, though in the chambers of fate there was a noisy debate about what sort of life should arrive with that child. A woman of Argive blood, Alcmena, waited beneath Theban rafters, famous for her steadfastness, while far away a god disguised himself in familiar footsteps. And in the morning, neighbours whispered that the husband had returned from campaign a little too quietly, that the house smelled of thunder, that the oil lamps went out without smoke. Scholars have argued gently and for centuries about which city may claim him first and which genealogy is truest. Thebes for nurture, Argos for ancestry, the Perseid line that ran like a bright thread back to Perseus and Danae. Yet the stories agree on one firm stone. His beginning was a tangle of promise and peril. Hera, whose crown was woven from order and marriage law, felt the braid of that law tug loose, and her anger travelled the air like a cold wind that finds door cracks even in careful houses. She went to the Moirai, say some, and persuaded the spinners of allotment to re-time the births of princes, so that a weaker cousin might be born first and inherit the sceptre, and so, in a gesture that sounds almost like a sigh, destiny bent around an infant not yet breathing. Others recall another omen, a swath of spilled milk from a startled goddess, streaking the heavens into a pale road, the Milky Way, after the baby was put to Hera's breast in a ruse, and her divine milk, rejected, fell into the night. From that brief touch, he won strength that would never quite belong to mortals alone. The name chosen for him was an irony with soft edges, the glory of Hera, as if people in old courts learned early how to soothe storms with titles. Perhaps names do not change the sea, but they can teach sailors to listen to waves. When he lay in his cradle, silence gathered like velvet around the planks, and the candle wick made a little dome of gold. Then so many urns and painted vases insist on this. 2 snakes thick as braided rope slid over the threshold, green with a sheen like winter olives. They moved without hurry, the way trouble moves when it knows its route. The nurse shrieked. Amphitryon rushed in with a sword that did not matter. Alcmena reached for the child but could not outrun the thin hiss of fate. He reached first. Little hands, round as figs, closed around the serpents, and the rush of their coils found no purchase. He squeezed until the hissing turned to the dry crackle of rope under strain, until the chamber filled with an unexplainable quiet, the sort that follows thunder rather than precedes it. In later years, poets embroidered meaning into that cradle. Some said the snakes were Hera's test, others a sign that the child would wrestle chaos. A few quiet voices, more philosophical than pious, wondered if the tale was a dream, remembered too sharply by a proud household. But even doubts, when told softly, can work like incense. They sting the eyes and sweeten the room. And so the omen lived, painted on cups, carved along temple metopes, sung in half-remembered measures by boatmen crossing the straits at dusk. He grew in stories the way olive trees grow in stony soil, slowly, stubbornly, secretly drinking light from fissures. Some nights he would stand in the courtyard while an old tutor traced constellations with a reed, telling him that heroes are not made when they break the world, but when they bend themselves to carry what the world cannot. Other nights he would mistake his strength for wisdom and feel the reprimand of elders like a low bell. The household learned to hide fragile things. He learned that apology, while heavy on the tongue, eases the shoulders. From the hills came tales of a lion whose hide could not be pierced. From the city came rumours of politics so fine-grained they could turn justice to powder Between those rumours and those hills, a boy walked, already shadowed by a man larger than the streets that should have contained him. If he laughed, doors opened. If he frowned, doors remembered how to close. And always, the quiet pressure of hearers' attention, more presence than event, ran beneath the days like a dark river, not always visible but always there, teaching him that blessings and trials are sometimes braided until they are indistinguishable. On one dawn of pale copper, he watched a pair of storks trade places on a roof nest, while the city shook off its wheels of dust. He felt a pull, call it longing, or restlessness, or the first itch of purpose that made the brickwork seem narrow. Old priests will later claim that a whisper from Delphi had already turned toward him, that the god of flutes and riddles had prepared a lesson about guilt and cleansing, about labour as a bridge across regret. But in that moment he knew only this, that the world was wide and wrong in many places, and that both gentleness and force lived in him like twin fires asking to be tended. What omens attended his step that day? The shade of the western wall lay shorter than it should have. A dog howled at no one and then remembered to wag its tail. A mother dropped a loaf and laughed because it landed soft side up. Small signs crowd the beginnings of great lives, like birds on the rigging of a ship not yet sailed. Sometimes late tellers of early events place before him a crossroads, two women personified as virtue and vice, one plain and shining like morning water, the other draped and easy as afternoon. And though philosophers know this parable comes from the wise Prodicus, possibly written later, and dressed in his name like a well-fitted tunic, the choice in it feels true. For even a child of thunder must choose, again and again, to turn muscle into mercy, skill into service, victory into balance. Perhaps that is why his earliest omens carried both light and sting, a goddess's milk that promised strength, a goddess's fury that promised consequence, serpents that asked for courage and restraint in the same breath. What we are given and what we owe, these twin cords will knot themselves through his days. And then, because every story that hopes to last must push its walker onto a road, messengers arrived with tidings harsh as unripe fruit. There would be tasks long and humbling, set not by love but by duty, watched by eyes that wished him to fail. There would be teachers with patient hands and enemies with patient grudges. And the moon, patient of all, would watch him like a white coin held between the fingers of night. He took a breath, the first of many that would steady whole hillsides, and stepped forward. In the cool blue, before sunrise, the city seemed to fold itself back like a curtain, and beyond it, the hills lifted their dark shoulders as if to say, "Come then." He grew into the shape foretold by cradle and omen, yet the household still called him by tender names, and tried, as all families do, to fold a giant into ordinary rooms. The threads of lineage were explained to him with patient fingers, how his mother's blood ran back to Perseus, how Amphitryon, decent and dutiful, had taken the burden of raising a boy who bent doors and dented bronze bowls without meaning to, how the city of Thebes claimed him with the same pride that Argos felt in the old Perseid line. And the boy listened as one listens to the sea from inland, sensing a destiny without yet understanding its tides. Tutors arrived like seasons. Linus, small and exacting, taught measure and lyre, and on a day when the strings would not obey, when strength tried to wrestle music rather than coax it, an accident banged the lesson into tragedy. Fear and grief shook the household, and the city murmured about chance and temper and the gravity that attends great gifts. That story, painted later on cups in fine black figure, warned him that power, when held too tightly, spills. After morning, he was sent to the hills where Chiron, the wise centaur, kept a school of safer proportions. Under pines that pressed their resin scent into memory, he learned that herbs could cool fever, that measured breath steadies a bow, that a wound can teach the hand that inflicted it to bind gently. Chiron's voice moved like a stream across stones, reminding him that the body is a door, not a wall. A castor, half-divine horseman, taught the grace of balance, and the boy who could lift a plough learned the quieter art of not frightening a skittish mare. Autolycus, the nimble trickster, made of him a less clumsy hunter and a more suspicious friend. Eurytus, proud archer, honed his aim until an apple at 70 paces seemed as wide as a shield. Yet one of the first foes he met was not a beast in the thicket, but the ancient shadow of anger. When drink loosened tongues in the city, and old men compared him to iron and thunder, he felt the hot wish to be only himself, not the rumour of himself, and he learned to leave the cup before it emptied him. In the Cytheran hills, a lion had begun to harry herds and shepherds, knotting the local knights with fear. Farmers described a hide thick as oaths, a roar that made goats forget the way home. He went out with a simple club, the tool that felt most honest in his hands, and found that courage is less a shout than a long breath taken in the dark. By morning the pastures were quiet, and the sun combed the grass with ordinary light. Some say this lion was the lesser cousin of the one he would meet later. Some say the tale is a rehearsal told backward, but either way the lesson held: meet trouble with clear eyes and finish what you start. Hera's presence did not vanish. It thinned and thickened like weather. Sometimes a sudden gust that scattered plans, sometimes a high glassy sky that made his successes seem small. On festival days, he helped raise poles in shade, carried amphorae as if they were wicker, and the children of the quarter followed him with the shameless delight that greets a kindly giant. He returned their games with a patience learned from Chiron, letting little hands weigh his wrists as if measuring the world's hinge. Priests of Apollo who loved to lean meaning against coincidence watched him from temple steps and spoke in low conjectures about guilt and cleansing, about how a certain man, pressed by fate and by his own errors, would one day come to Delphi asking what is owed when strength has hurt, what it meant to protect. He felt that future, like the cool circle of a ring, not yet slipped onto the finger. And still, life tried to teach him its small domestic truths, that laughter oils the hinge of a door, that bread tastes more honest after work, that a neighbour's story can be a map through a difficult afternoon. If you, listening now in the hush of some room far from Thebes, perhaps in a city where the rain scribbles on windows, perhaps in a countryside where crickets sow the edges of dark, feel a kinship with the long apprenticeship of becoming, know that the old stories were told for nights like this. Where are you hearing this from, and what time is it there? If the way this journey is unfolding brings you comfort, you're warmly invited to subscribe to the entire history, so we can keep walking these lamplit roads together, gently and unhurried. Scholars still argue softly about whether his mentors were gathered by memory into a single luminous cluster, or whether years and cities replaced one another like beads, but the debates only polish the image, a youth hammered into patience by careful hands. Amphitryon, measuring the boy's reach against doorframes, understood what fathers of unusual children have always understood, that love is a kind of bracing, a scaffold built as the tower goes up, and that praise must be steady, not extravagant. Alcmene lit lamps at twilight and listened to his day as if listening could make tomorrow kinder. Yet fate like a tide pulling under the surface, moved toward its necessary whirl. There came a night when dreams leaned hard upon his sleep. A laurel stood in a windless courtyard, and still its leaves whispered. A tripod of gold seemed to breathe. A voice, without a mouth, asked a question about debt and repair. He woke before dawn, and found the city holding its breath in that pale interval when even dogs pause their watchfulness. The road to Delphi began at the edge of common streets like any road, and soon left them like a slow river leaving a field. Dust rose, chaff hovered, crows stitched black thread from one olive to the next. He walked. Behind him, Thebes unrolled its walls to the sun. Ahead, somewhere beyond 3 bends and the cool lift of a mountain shoulder, there waited a god famous for telling hard truths in soft, oblique sentences. The hills he had learned in youth seemed to lean in, as if to hear the answer with him, and the air, thin and clean as a vow, carried the scent of pine and stone and the faint metallic promise of destiny. Far above, a hawk drew a quiet circle, and the laurel leaves of the future murmured again. The road to Delphi thinned into stone and hush, and when he reached the sacred hollow, the air itself felt braided, pine and laurel, breath and prophecy. The priestess sat above a tremor of the earth, and the words, however later ages argue about who shaped them, fell like soft iron into his life, to cleanse what cannot be undone, to heal the harm that strength misled has sown. He must yield his will to a smaller king and accept labours numbered like the months of a stern year. The tale, told in shaded porticos and under winter roofs, never hides the wound that led him there, a madness not of his choosing passing over him like a dark river, and loved ones lost to a night he would spend all future days trying to repay. The Greeks, who understood that tragedy is a teacher in the clothing of a storm, did not excuse him. They gave him a road. Serve Eurystheus of Tiryns, said the god, and let each task anchor one mile corner of a soul blown by harsh winds. He bowed, not as a slave bows, but as a man bows before the weight he has decided to carry. And something in the world, hearing that decision, settled like grain in a jar. The message was brought to Thebes and Argos, to halls where men with measured voices tried to make fate sound administrative. Messengers listed terms and witnesses counted nods. He set aside what he might have been, the easy banquets, the warm chair near a hearth that would always be his, and took up the stranger's cloak of service, rough as penance, clean as morning water. On the road to Tiryns he walked as if each footprint were an answer. Hills unrolled, olive groves blinked silver, dogs pretended to ignore him, and then fell into step. At shrines by the path he left small offerings, not of gold, but of attention. He straightened a fallen garland. He lifted a child to ring a bell too high for little arms. He shared bread with a shepherd who had learned to speak to silence. If an anger stirred, it was the kind that warms without burning, the anger of a man impatient to make repair. In the citadel, Eurystheus tried to arrange himself into majesty, a man used to doors opening before he reached them. He masked unease with ceremony and spoke through heralds as if distance could make him larger. 12 labours then, said the mouthpieces, 12 places where danger had laid its dark stones, 12 creatures or riddles that made villagers hold their breath at night. The first would be the lion of Nemea, whose hide men swore could not be pierced, whose lair was a door through which light entered only once each day and came out thinner. He left with no armour bright enough to distract fear. A club of olive wood rode his shoulder, honest and heavy. A bow and a handful of arrows whispered against his back. The land near Nemea held the middling smells of life, smoked cheese, new-cut grass, leather hung to dry, and the low talk of people who wished him well, without daring to wish too loudly. Before the cave, he paused, the way sailors pause before untying, tasting the sky for weather. Tracks near the mouth looked like a script written by a hand that hated punctuation. The air held a warm rot, and the iron breath of a creature that believed itself unanswerable. He tried arrow and spear and learned again that knowledge is often the price of failure. The shafts glanced and the beast laughed without sound, so he did what the old tutors had taught him, in quieter fields. He changed the problem. He watched the hill for an hour and found a narrow cleft, choked with bramble, that led to a side chamber. He moved rock by patient rock. No flourish, no hero's shout, and closed one mouth of the cave with a wall that would have suited a careful farmer. Then, club lowered, he entered by the other and set his body between the creature and the remaining light. What followed is carved in many stones in a dozen ways, sometimes with a flourish of muscle, sometimes with a simplicity that feels truer. In the telling that breathes best at night, there was little noise. Two bodies learned each other's weight, claws rang dull against skin that did not care, arms remembered without thinking the slow circle of a wrestling hold shown once by Chiron in a meadow where bees drowsed. He shifted, he waited. He did not hurry the ending. When the lion slept, the last sleep that begins in the bones, he stood a while in the dim and let his breath even itself, counting not kills, but heartbeats returned to shepherds' wives, goats recovered by small boys, with sticks, paths safe again for tired feet. Outside evening combed the hills with long bronze teeth. He tried to cut the hide, and learned again that some lessons come twice. Then he recalled the tutor's quiet insistence that brains are not a betrayal of brawn. With the beast's own claw, he worked the seam, and the skin let go like night letting go of stars at dawn. He drew it over his shoulders. It fit not like pride but like responsibility, a reminder visible from far off that strength should make others safer. Farmers came at a distance first, then nearer with jars of rough wine and bread, scored with a mother's thumb. He did not let the party grow loud. Grief does not like trumpets. He shared. He smiled carefully, and when children asked whether lions dream, he said he hoped so, that even fierce things might find a meadow in their last sleep. If you are hearing this under your own gentle ceiling, with a clock breathing its slow numbers into the dark, tell me, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it there? If the softness of these old roads and steady labours keeps your eyes calm, you're warmly invited to subscribe to the entire history so we can return to them together, night after night, unhurried. He slept that night near a low wall. The pelt curled over him like a moonless sky. And in the distance the cave breathed quietly to itself, no longer a threat but a room emptied of fear. And far away, in a city of polished stones, a small king tried to smile, as if he had not just taught a great man how to solve a problem. Morning found him wrapped in the quiet gravity of the lion's pelt, its weight sitting on his shoulders, not as boast, but as vow. The club rode his palm with the familiarity of a walking stick, and the road unrolled toward Lerna, where reeds whispered to one another about an old scaled rumour. The marsh there held a patience different from hills. Water keeps secrets longer than stone, and villagers spoke of cattle that vanished into mist, of dogs that returned limping and silent, of a stink like wet iron. Some say the creature had 9 heads, others that the number was a moon's trick, multiplying fear on the trembling surface. What agreed among all mouths was this: cut one, and 2 grow back, as if mischief had learned how to copy itself. He stood at the rim of Lerna and watched bubbles rise without haste. watched dragonflies draw bright stitchwork above the slime, and remembered Chiron's counsel that not every foe should be met where it is strongest. He wet a cloth and tied it over his nose, a small gesture against the breath of the mire, then cut a length of wood for fire-hardened stakes, thinking less of glory than of anchoring the ground to himself. When the creature came, shoulders breaking water like small islands, eyes the colour of a forge seen through damp, the day narrowed. He used arrows first, and learned, as men do in courts and kitchens, that some beginnings are only introductions. The shafts sank and annoyed, which can be a kind of information. He stepped forward over the spongy edge and felt the marsh testing his ankles like a cautious host. With the club he broke ahead, and at the wet stump 2 answered, eager, quick. It would have been easy then to let anger set the rhythm, to swing faster and find himself trellised by a fever of multiplying throats. Instead, he withdrew 3 paces, the number of prudence, and called for help. Whether the helper was Aeolus, cousin and friend, arriving with a torch and quick wits, or whether the helper was simply the idea that 2 hands can solve what one makes worse, the stories vary with the cups that carry them. But every telling worth keeping agrees that the next choice was fire. Cauterize, said the part of him that remembers solutions more than moments. And so it went with the unhurried cruelty of medicine. Club, then flame, strike, then seal. Pain asking for more pain to be made less. The air filled with an odour that rusted thought at the edges, and reeds bowed as if in pity. A great central head, older than the others, meaner in some weary way, reared up with a slowness that seemed like confidence. For that one he saved the steadying of both feet and the breath that makes an arrow honest. The shaft found its small truth, and the head fell as if remembering how to be heavy. When the stirring water ceased to invent more mouths, he stood with the torch's after-image reddening the inside of his closed eyes, and let the marsh speak again, which it did in little glugs and soft resignations. From the ruined necks he took a darker lesson, one that scholars, when they are feeling generous, call practical piety. He dipped his arrows in the blood that refused to be simple. Henceforward, each feathered thought in his quiver would carry a fate beyond muscle, a whisper of poison that turned victory into distance. Sometimes the tools we inherit from our battles make the next battle shorter, and sometimes they simply make us quieter. He did not smile. He rinsed his hands in a clear rill that ran to the side of the swamp as if unwilling to be introduced to its neighbour, and he thought of how often harm invites cleverness, and cleverness once taught does not forget. The lion's hide drank light. The club, smoke-stained now, looked older than the hour. He cut the stumps and buried them with a farmer's thoroughness, tamping mud down until the earth stopped arguing. Then he stacked stones to keep restless stories from climbing back into the air. Nearby, a heron lifted with the gravity of a thought changing its mind, and frogs resumed a practice of small songs. Villagers came, thin with vigilance, carrying bread, onions, cool water. He ate slowly, as if careful chewing were another form of respect, and when a child asked if monsters have mothers, he answered that everything born is born from something, and that perhaps pity is another kind of arrow one should learn to keep unpoisoned. And if you, listening with the lamp turned low, while your room folds itself into the shape of night, feel some ease at the sound of work done thoroughly. Tell me where you are in the world, and what time the clock is riding on your wall. If these old roads help your breathing fall into a calmer gait, you're gently invited to subscribe to the entire history so we can keep returning to them, softly, patiently, together. With dusk combing the Lerna reeds, he tested one of the newly darkened arrows against a fallen log and watched the wound smoke, as if the wood had a memory. A tool had changed him, and he knew it. He slept that night a little removed from the marsh, the ground firmer, the sky marginally less secretive. In his dream, a hind ran with hooves that made no sound even on stone, and antlers that seemed almost like branches the forest had loaned to motion. When he woke, he still felt the echo of its running in his ribs, as if the heart sometimes learns its next lesson before the feet do. Far off, in halls, where a small king pretended calm, news of a marsh grown quieter arrived with the thud of an unopened lettuce. And between the spent fire and the first pale talk of birds, he rose, gathered the club and the bough, drew the lion's hood over his brow, and turned toward the cool, elusive glimmer of the Cyrenaean woods, where speed would ask to be met, not with pursuit alone, but with patience that listens like a hunter to the breathing of leaves. The Cyrenaean woods received him with a cool breath that tasted of resin and running shade, and for the first time in these stern errands, he understood that a labour might ask not for force or clever fire, but for patience stretched long and fine, like a bow drawn to the ear and then held without loosing. The hind he sought wore antlers like a small crown of living branches, hooves that left almost no sentence on the earth, and a speed that made distance feel like silk being pulled slowly through careful fingers. Some say it belonged to Artemis herself, a creature set apart, gold-shod and hallowed. Others, quieter but insistent, say that holiness is not borrowed but inherent, that any life moving so gently becomes its own sanctuary. He did not argue with either rumour. Instead, he listened to the forest the way one listens to a friend's hesitation, without interruption, learning the different dialects of leaf and stream. Dawn after dawn, he followed sign that was more suggestion than proof, the tip of a fern pressed down, and then remembering to stand, a bead of water shaken from moss in a place where no breeze seemed to pass, a crescent print in damp earth so light he wondered if the ground had dreamed it. Months braided themselves around the chase until the year itself seemed to be wearing thin. Summer thinned into a finer gold. Autumn braided smoke into the afternoon. Winter pressed its cool palm to the bark and made every sound smaller. When the wind travelled, it carried smells he could count. Pine, a distant fleece, the sweet iron of a stream sliding over stones, his own patience warming and cooling again. He forgot to be angry. He remembered to breathe. There were days when he could have ended the trial with an arrow and a whisper, for even a consecrated creature can be crossed by a mortal's line of sight. But he had learned something out in the Lerna reads about means and ends, about how certain victories taste bitter on the tongue that wins them. So he ran without loosing, and learned a hunter's mercy that is also a kind of worship. In one telling, he finally caught the hind, where frost wrote itself on grass at evening, and the air became as thin as a vow. He circled her, not with rope, but with stillness, and when she tried to spring, his hands, careful as those of a midwife, steadied the slender legs. In another, he waited by the river Ladon until the water itself asked for quiet, and the hind entered, trusting the glass. There he closed his fingers around a moment, rather than a throat. Artemis, say the old voices, came then in a drift of silence that made the trees remember their childhood. She and her brother stood with faces like weather that has not yet chosen its direction. He bowed, not the bow of a subject before a court, but the bow of a man who knows the difference between use and desecration, and explained that his errand was not to harm, but to return alive what had been borrowed by oath and necessity. The goddess who courts the untamed and guards the line where wildness drinks, heard the hinge of his answer and let it swing. She allowed the hind to go with him, on the condition that the creature would know no pain and would see its woods again. This is how some labours end, not with cheering, not with a trophy raised, but with a breath released and a promise kept so cleanly that the world grows a shade kinder. He walked beside the hind when walking was possible and watched her trot just ahead when pride required the extra yard. Through hamlets he held up his hand, and the curious fell back, sensing the thin veil of the sacred moving with the pair. Eurystheus, who had expected blood, who imagined strength only in the past tense of breaking, tried to tangle the report in conditions and parchment, but the truth arrived before his paperwork. The hind's eyes were clear, its flanks unscarred, its breath even. And truth, when it stands patiently in a courtyard, is difficult to argue with. He released her the moment the tally was taken, and the creature leapt back into the trees, as if entering a sentence she had almost forgotten how to finish. He watched the branches close, and the ache that came felt oddly sweet, like the ache of a lesson learned without humiliation. Not every victory wants to be held. Some only ask to be guided home. If you were hearing this with the lamp turned low and the room settling around you like a gentle cloak, tell me softly, where are you listening from? And what time is the night riding across your window? If these ancient footfalls ease the heart a little, you are warmly invited to subscribe to the entire history so we can keep walking these silvery paths together, returning, unrushed, to the old places where courage also means restraint. He slept that evening under a sky rinsed clear by winter, and the stars seemed to be practicing a slower blinking, as if they too were learning patience. In his dream, the forest exhaled, and a great boar shouldered out of snow with a snort like a kettle refusing its lid. When he woke, the world smelled of iron and pine, and a track led upward into country where boulders learned to roll when asked rudely. Ahead lay the Erymanthian slopes, a creature with bristles stiff as spears, and a lesson not about speed or sanctity, but about steering fury toward a ravine where it could be held without shame. And far away, in rooms where a small king rehearsed new demands, a fresh fear tugged at ceremony's hem, for he had begun to suspect that a man who can wait a year for a hind can outlast almost anything the world will set before him. Snow kept its own counsel in the Erymanthian heights, drifting into gullies and polishing stone until the paths forgot their edges. He moved through that pale hush with the lion's hood pulled forward, his breath writing small vanishing script before him, the club a dark punctuation against the white. The boar had been seen at dusk and dawn, the hours when the world loosens and tightens its belt, and shepherds spoke of tusks like bent moons, and a temper that made trees remember how to step aside. Yet before he found the beast, he found a door, really, a cave arranged like a door, where a gentle order warmed the cold. Pholus lived there, a centaur with hands that liked jars and shelves, and the graceful arrangement of simple things. Smoke braided upward, meat whispered over coals, and the long body of the host moved with housekeeping ease. Here was friendship, that soft architecture which makes a stranger's shoulders forget their armour for a while. They ate, they spoke of snow lines, and of years that hide inside other years, of wines that teach conversation to grow branches, and the way winter makes every truth sound closer to the bone. In a corner, a sealed jar waited with the modesty of something communal, stamped with a sign that meant, "This belongs to many, and should be opened only when many are ready." Kindness, not mischief, turned the seal, Pholus curious, the guest unworried, and the perfume of the wine rose into the cold outside like a summons, not meant as a summons. From the slopes came the hoof drum of kin, who lived nearer to appetite than to patience. A dozen, then more, then enough to turn the air muscular. He stepped between hearth and threshold as he had stepped between cave and lion, wishing to keep a small room unbroken, and tried with words first, as Chiron had taught, the tone that tells hot minds the weather will change if they wait. But words are chords that sometimes slip, and the old quick anger that runs in gatherings where pride has had too much to drink found the jar, found the guest, found the old embarrassment of a centaur who wishes to be both weathered and civilized. Arrows did what they were made to do, though he used them with the reluctance taught to him at Lerna. The poison he had learned to carry was a gravity that did not care who stumbled. In the tumble that followed, stories later said, a shaft meant only to warn, glanced and found a target the heart could not bear. Chiron, somewhere beyond the cave's circle of warmth, the great tutor whose body had outlived many small wars. With itself, the wound did not kill, immortal flesh despises conclusions, but it hurt with the old pure honesty that leaves no room for bravado. He bound, he apologized, with hands and with breath, and Chiron, who had taught him that even medicine can do harm while doing good, nodded with the slow forgiveness that winter sometimes grants to those who move through it carefully. Pholus, curious, even in grief, plucked another arrow from a body and marvelled aloud at the smallness of the thing that carried such consequence. In the next heartbeat, the consequence reminded itself, and the cave remembered silence with terrible clarity. Snow at the mouth of the cave recorded nothing but more snow. Inside they set the fallen in a posture that felt like a sentence almost finished, and the fire made its small, tireless argument for warmth. He left at dawn with the gentleness of someone closing a door for sleepers he will never see again. The boar's track unrolled like a rope, cut by hooves, down to wallows, iced into mirrors, up to thickets, left ragged by a body that loved to argue with anything in front of it. He kept his pace honest, not hurried, the way one walks a thought toward a conclusion that will hold in daylight, when the bristled hill finally moved of its own will and the snow tossed itself in angry secrets. He did not attempt to outshout the mountain. He teased, he steered, he let the animal's certainty become a tool, to the left when it preferred the right, up when it preferred down, until the fatigue that knows nothing of pride made the decision he was waiting for. A ravine opened like a careful mouth. There he turned quickly, a shepherd of rage, and pressed the great body into a pocket of earth and echo, where it could thrash without harm to anything but its own story. The tusks carved arguments in the air, and then slowed. The breath like bellows settled into the slower work of winter. He roped at the boar with loops that remembered ships and docks he had once passed in other towns, each not a quiet promise not to humiliate what had simply been too much itself. When he returned, dragging a sledge, the villagers stirred from the rapt posture of cold and came to count what had been taken from their nights. Children counted bristles. Old men traced the arc of tusks with the same long attention they gave to weather. Women who kept houses on the lip of wind measured the calm with a private arithmetic known only to those who run a family's traffic through thin seasons. He did not parade the beast through the town like an emblem. He showed it as one shows a solved problem to the person who set it, and in the palace of a small man who disguised his envy with columns, the sight of a hero laughing gently with a hog made ceremony look like a costume better suited to festival than to rule. Yet the snow had written other lessons on his skin. He felt how thin the world's membrane can be between feast and fight, between medicine and harm, between fellowship and the sudden clatter of grief. He learned again that the tools we carry from one success, poison, speed, rope, wit, arrive as both answer and question at the next threshold. In the evenings that followed, he slept as men sleep, who have moved a great weight without hating it, and his dreams smelled of pine and wine and laundry steam, odd consolations camped together under the same roof. The Erymanthian boar lay quiet and far off in a cave that had known the shape of hospitality. Vessels were arranged in a new order that honoured what had gone wrong, without letting wrongness become the master of the room. When the thaw began in narrow seams down the hillside, he turned toward low country, and the rumour of a task that sounded like mockery, cleaning what generations had chosen not to see, washing the patients out of filth without insulting the labourers who had shovelled around it for years. Rivers waited in their beds like tired draught animals, and stone fences practised being walls again, now that the snow had stopped confusing their top lines. He walked with the boar's rope burn still faint on his palms, and the remembered weight of a friend's shoulder under his hands, and in the margin where the last ice receded, meadow grass inhaled as if relieved to discover it still knew how. Ahead, a king who loved large numbers and neglected corners had stables the size of a boast, and a pride willing to let another man do the washing, and the wind, travelling from barnyards to hillsides, brought a smell that was not noble but true, the odour of work postponed too long, and of water thinking about what it might accomplish if asked with the right kind of politeness. The lowlands announced themselves by smell before they declared their geography, sweet hay and sour neglect braided together, manure grown arrogant from generations of being told it was tomorrow's problem, a vast patience curdled into affront. And in the middle of that odour sat a king who counted cattle the way other men count praises, his barns and stalls stretching like a small province under roofs that had learned to sag politely. Algeus received him with a host's smile and a creditor's eyes, speaking in fat numbers and thin promises, as if the size of his herds excused the poverty of his drains. There was a task here, yes, one that everyone for years had admired from a distance and skirted with a joke: clean the royal stables in a single day. And if the stranger succeeded, 1/10 of the herds would be his reward, said the king with an airy flick of the hand, as if fractions cost nothing when spoken swiftly. He walked the aisles with his cloak held slightly aside, and began to understand why men prefer monsters. Filth does not roar or rear, it creeps. It becomes the room's grammar until even decent noses surrender. It teaches resignation. Workers had done what they could with forks and carts, but labour, when asked to fight a flood with a bucket for too many years, learns to look away. He touched gateposts slick with the brown memory of seasons and the walls that had forgotten their original colour, and he watched flies write their own frantic scripture in the air. Then he walked outside and climbed a small hill to look for what might help that was not a broom. 2 rivers, the Alpheus and the Peneus, went about their old errands in parallel, tidy as long habits, and he saw at once what every shepherd knows and every king forgets: water prefers work to ceremony. He measured distances with the human instrument that never breaks, a pair of steady eyes and the body's sense of slope, and he felt beneath his boots the subtle tilt of a valley eager to teach someone geometry without when using a single number. He spoke to labourers in the plain language of usefulness: bring shovels, picks, stakes, gather ropes that remember ships, fetch mattocks that have tasted roots but not yet stones, and their weariness brightened the way a dull blade brightens under a honest whet. He marked 2 cuts with ashes and with his walking staff, and he told the men what the day would be. Not a punishment for having put off a chore too long, but a demonstration of how a mind can make a friend of gravity. They began at dawn, when the light was still undecided, and by the time the sun declared itself, the ground had opened 2 new mouths polite enough to accept the borrowed rivers. He stood in the trench with calves biting and hands blistering, not because a hero's sweat is needed for water to travel, but because example is the oldest mathematics. Where he lifted, others lifted. Where he did not grumble, complaint discovered it could keep its voice for evening songs. At the signal, a small nod, really, they drew the last stakes, and the warder considered, paused like a guest at an unfamiliar threshold, and then entered the stables with the humble mindlessness that makes it the best servant and the worst god. The first rush argued with old Muck, lifted it the way a mother lifts a child from a stubborn chair. The second remembered cracks and found them. The third ran head down like a team of oxen pulling together after the first stubborn inches of a load. Dung, straw, the slick alphabet of long neglect, all loosed their allegiance to corners and posts and floated like disappointing thoughts toward an exit they should have chosen years ago. Inside, men planted their feet and guided the torrent with planks and shouts and laughter that surprised them. Outside, women carried buckets of clean sand to scrub the scruple back into floors that had forgotten how to be proud. Flies lifted in a bewildered cloud and went looking for a memory that would no longer be there. Swallows, opportunists of grace, traced their black parentheses over the brief chaos, turning utility into a dance. By noon, the barns were learning to echo again, a sound most listeners do not notice until it returns. And by evening, the last of the filth lay in a shallow lagoon where reeds would soon be glad. He walked the aisles once more, hand on rough posts that now rasped like honest wood, and he felt that most domestic of satisfactions settle in his chest, not triumph, not conquest, but the relieved quiet that follows a job done to the bottom. There are victories that look beautiful in sculpture. There are others that smell better in the morning. Alchaz received the news as a man receives a letter that refuses to be misread. He smiled the way weather smiles when it plans rain for a wedding, and called for counsellors who wore their hair like arguments. Suddenly, the promise of a 10th became a dispute about witnesses, about whether a son of Zeus should be entitled to wages for service any decent neighbour would have offered, about whether the day had been a miracle or a trick. He asked for judges, confident that ceremony could strangle clarity, but truth, washed and standing in the courtyard, was inconveniently present. He argued that rerouting a river was cheating, as if brilliance were a kind of theft. He hinted that perhaps the visitor had not truly touched muck, as if the clean hands of a king could teach the calloused hands of workers anything worth repeating. The hero's face did not change, but those who watched closely later said that a new line took up residence around his mouth, the crease men get when they finally understand that some oaths break themselves before they are spoken. The quarrel swelled, broke, and left behind a resolution that tastes like copper. He would collect nothing here but knowledge. He left the valley with the smell of clean wood and wet straw sweetening the air behind him, and with a handful of men and boys walking a while beside him, grateful in that wordless way workers have for someone who has made their day better without making them smaller. In later years, some say, he founded games where men would sweat in public for honour rather than wages, a gentle revenge on those who thought a contract spirit could be watered down like cheap wine. Others say only that he moved on, which is what most of us do, after learning that cleverness can do the work, but cannot force gratitude to bloom. Evening laid its long hand over the plain, and the birds that prefer roofs to trees counted new perches on cleaned beams. He looked east, where marshes darkened into a single, thoughtful colour, and heard a rumour thin as wire. Up in the Arcadian air, a flock with metal in its wings had made a lake into an occupied sky, dropping barbed gifts on anyone who came near, their beaks and feathers whispering the word iron every time they beat it. He turned toward that rumour, as one turns toward a draft sneaking under a door, more irritated for the villagers than for himself, and as the last light gathered its skirts at the hem of the hills, he set his steps to the Stymphalian road. In the half-distance, somewhere between reed and star, a sound like a choir of arrows practising without bows trembled across the water, and the lake, wide and still, lay waiting like a thought that will not quiet. The lake at Stymphalos lay broad and watchful, a sheet of tarnished bronze, under a winter sun that could not quite remember how to be warm. Reeds whispered along the margins like a congregation exchanging cautious greetings, and in the middle distance, something metallic turned light into a nervous shiver. The villagers had taught their fear to speak softly. Men mended nets indoors by daylight they once loved. Women sent children on errands that circled wide of water, and when they spoke of the flock, their voices kept glancing upward, as if sound itself might draw the blades down. The birds were not merely many, they were made of wrongness refined, pinions hard as hammered leaf, beaks that bit like small precise tools, and feathers that could be shaken loose as needles, a rain of iron sighs. He stood at the shore and let the quiet take inventory of him. Lion's hide, drinking the thin sun, bow quiet across the shoulder, club planted like a sapling that trusted his hand. He tasted the air and found it salted by old panic. This would not be a labour of muscle against muscle, he thought, nor exactly a duel of wits. It was a matter of changing a room's acoustics so that a problem would choose a different door. He walked the perimeter where mud held the signatures of careful feet, and listened to how small sounds carried, frog coughs, reed rubs, the distant clack of a shutter. Then he put his hand on his heart and timed its beat to the lake's slow breath. The flock rose briefly, a black-laced thought, and settled again with a hiss, like 100 knives being relished. He watched how they kept their distance from shore, not out of fear, but from a well-learned advantage. They had taught the lake to be their wall. There are moments when old gifts, given by strangers with bright eyes, step out of memory as if they had been waiting in a side room. He remembered the bronze crotala clappers set in his pack long ago by one who loved inventions more than titles, and he smiled the small private smile of a man meeting a tool at the exact corner of need. He climbed a slope where the wind could carry his sound across open water and where the reeds would not swallow the rhythm. Then he waited for the lake to hold still enough to hear itself. When the air balanced on its own point, he brought the clappers together. The first strike startled a few wings only. The second braided with the first to become pattern. The third arrived as insistence, the fourth as law. Sound went out like a net, and the sky remembered that it had more uses than being merely above. The flock tore itself from the water with a violence that belonged to storms, lifting as if the lake were suddenly too small to bear their reflection, and the geometry of their flight, sharp turns, hard angles, made daylight flinch. He did not shout victory. He let the rhythm continue until the birds were committed to air, until their weapons were in motion rather than stored. Then he set down the clappers with the tenderness one gives to a friend, finished with his part, and took up the bow that had learned, back at Lerna, how an arrow can carry more than wood and point. He loosed with the old respect that keeps a hunter quiet inside his skull, aiming not to boast, but to reduce danger. Feathers fell like a cold rain that could cut cloth. He watched their angles and stepped where absence would be, not where threat currently was, feet choosing gaps the way a thoughtful sentence chooses its commas. Arrows did their clean arithmetic. The air stung of iron, burned marsh, and the strange sweetness of something that had misused the sky being told, gently but thoroughly, to land. Some fled toward mountains jagged enough to speak their language. Some circled, confused, then discovered that stubbornness is not a shield. Some thudded into reeds and made a sound almost like sick applause. The lake took back their images without affection, and the wind, satisfied, unknotted itself. He lowered the bow and listened as silence stitched itself, unhurried, over the torn moment. Out in the middle distance, a small island that had been theirs alone lay empty as an unkept promise. Nearer shore, a handful of bodies floated, their metal dulling, as if shame had weight. He waded in, not deep, just enough to take hold of what could hurt a child tomorrow, and drew them to land one by one, laying them out with a respect born not of admiration, but of the simple understanding that even what threatens has a story. Villagers came with the care of people whose grief has taught them not to run. They brought baskets to gather what might be turned into tools, beaks good for chiselling, feathers to pin planks, and they asked with a caution that honoured the day whether the lake could be trusted again. He told them the truth that good work deserves, that trust returns like light in late winter, slowly, in longer and longer sentences, and that they would write those sentences together by standing on banks, by casting lines, by letting their children learn the water's old lullabies again. A boy dared the shore first with a stick, tapping a rhythm the clappers had started. A woman laughed that small, relieved laugh that leaks from a body before words can catch it. Somewhere a heron decided solemnity was overrated and stalked back to its tall gossip. He kept one feather, not as a treasure, but as a reminder that danger sometimes wears the right shape in the wrong substance. In his hands, it looked like a note from a stern teacher reading simply, "Remember." He cleaned his arrows carefully, thinking of how tools absorb the manners of their tasks. He wiped the bowstring and let it relax, then placed the crotala back in his pack with the gratitude due to a friend who does not ask for applause. The lake darkened into evening, trading bronze for ink, and frogs began again the gossip they had abandoned during the iron storm. He slept that night on a little rise stitched with time, and woke once to the sensation, impossible but persuasive, that the water was breathing more easily. At dawn, the rumour that always comes after a solved problem arrived with the bread, this time about a bull on an island where winds rehearse their crossings, a beast whose shoulders might have been carved by gusts themselves, whose temper had taught men new ways to be afraid of open fields. He could almost smell the sea in that rumour, salt and rope, and the sour tang of fish on stone. He rose, tightened the belt that had learned the measure of these months, and looked back at the lake one last time. A pair of ordinary ducks arrowed across its calm with the cheerful unseriousness of creatures that have never mistaken themselves for knives. He smiled, a small thing that felt like a stitch holding, and set his face toward the harbours and the low talk of sailors. Somewhere ahead, a king would pretend again that parchment can out-argue a deed, An island would offer blue distances to steady the mind, and a bull, white, strong, impatient, would teach another lesson about how force meets force without either losing its shape. And above all this, the broad sky rolled on, untroubled, as if keeping a gentle ledger, labours tallied, not only by danger ended, but by quiet return to places that had forgotten how to hear themselves breathe. The sea made a low, patient music as the ship shouldered its way toward Crete, that island which wears its myths like many layered garments. King and labyrinth, bull and law, dances that remember the shape of wind. He stood at the rail with salt gathering in the lion's fur and watched gulls practice a lazy mastery, their white pages turning in a book the sky never tires of reading. Behind him, the lake country in its iron storm had already thinned into a lesson kept, and ahead lay a beast whose fame arrived before its hooves. Sailors spoke of it with the fond exaggeration of the afraid, a bull, white as first frost, shoulders like a pair of gates, a stare that made men remember errands elsewhere. Some said Poseidon had once lifted it from the sea as a sign and a test, and that a king, dazzled then stingy, failed the courtesy due to gods. Others, more cautious with blame, said only that the island had been given a strength that would not be yoked. Harbour's smell of promises and fish, he stepped onto the quay with the steady tread of someone who has learned that trouble, when you greet it politely, sometimes forgets its lines. Minos received him in the practiced posture of rulers who have been obeyed long enough to find questions inconvenient. He wanted the bull taken, but his pride unruffled, the island safe, but his legend untouched. The hero listened without bristle, as one listens to weather, respectful, not credulous, and asked only for space to think with his hands. Fields in Crete are a conversation between stone and time, and the air, even when unkind, tastes of something domestic grown ancient. He walked the margins where hooves had cut undecided paths and found the animal not by sound but by a pressure in the day, the way a large presence changes how the light rests on grass. The bull was beautiful in the unarguable way cliffs are beautiful, form married to force with no thought of apology. It lowered its head, and the world tilted a little. He did not lift the bow. He let his own breath become slower than fear's drum, and began the old dance that shepherds know, the steps that turn anger sideways, that allow momentum to exhaust itself against emptiness instead of bone. The first rush past him like a weather front, heat and grunt, and the close smell of living power. He moved a half hand's width, which is to say he moved just enough, and the club in his grip behaved like a staff used to teach balance rather than punishment. He lifted dust without striking. He spoke to the bull with the grammar of absence. No wall, no blow, no straight line to push against, and little by little, the animal's insistence became a rhythm he could count, a hill shouldered up, politely nearby. He angled their dance toward its flank, not to trap, but to ask the land to lend him the gentlest of cages, slope on one side, thorn on another, a brief corridor of choices that all led to calm if taken. When the bull's breath grew loud enough to touch, and its eyes, which had been hard coins, softened into something more like weathered stone, he stepped in. Hands that could break a door, learned again how to forgive a hinge. He found the neck where it could be held without insult, and with a slip of rope and a quiet hand on the brow, he borrowed the animal's certainty for the length of a lead. Villagers watched from a distance they judged respectful and safe. Their children saw not a trophy, but a conversation, and they stored the pattern in their bones for later work with stubborn tasks. He led the bull, not as victors lead, high-chinned and theatrical, but his neighbours lead a large friend who has forgotten how to be ordinary. In the city, Minos tried to frame the scene as his own. Words arranged on steps, heralds fluting the air with formalities, but the plainness of the act made ceremony look like extra carvings on a spoon. He asked whether the beast would be slain in honour of this or that god. The guest shook his head, for he had learned already that some endings make future beginnings smaller. He would take the bull across the water, he said, away from the island's nerves to a place where its story could finish without scraping the names of kings. The chords were simple, the knots honest, and on the beach the tide pressed its wet hands into the sand as if counting, with childlike seriousness, the stages of a plan. The crossing was less a triumph than a sustained patience, deck groaning, hooves arguing with planks, sailors letting jokes keep fear friendly. He stood near the animal's shoulder and kept the ropes slack enough to be a suggestion, taut enough to be a promise. Gulls wrote easy sentences above, and once, at dusk, the bull exhaled in a way that sounded like a treaty being signed with no witnesses. On mainland stones, the wind felt different, less salted, more grassy, and the animal, faced with a new alphabet of smells, became smaller in its certainty. He led it inland to a place where fate's accounting would be cleaner. Some chronicles say he loosed it into fields that could stand its thunder until time wore it gentler. Others, that he presented it as proof to the small king who kept the ledger of labours, then turned it loose again, because not every capture needs a cage. Either way, the lesson kept its quiet shine. To master does not always mean to diminish. To lead is not to humiliate. And force, when met without hatred, sometimes learns the narrow gate back into harmlessness. He washed his hands afterward in a stream that spoke Cretan in pebbles and mainland in weeds, and the water, pleased to translate both, ran clearer for it. That night he slept without the pelt, choosing the cool as a kind of reset, and dreamed of hooves again, but these struck sparks on foreign stone, and carried riders with the cruel hilarity of men who confuse fear with entertainment. Morning brought the rumour to match the dream. In Thrace, they said, a king named Diomedes fed strangers to his horses, 4 creatures whose mouths had been taught to want what mouths should not want, a stable where hospitality had been turned inside out and nailed to the wall. He rose with that slow decisiveness travellers have when the next road is already a half-formed sentence in the mind. The sea smelled of farewells and beginnings, and somewhere beyond its measured heave, a coast waited, where the old grammar of welcome had been broken into jagged pieces. He tied the lion's hood back into place, set the club to his palm, and felt in his quiver the quiet weight of arrows that remembered Lerna. The ship's ropes sighed, the oars agreed, and as gulls unstitched the sky above the harbour, he faced the line where water and horizon shake hands, thinking of horses made wrong by a man's appetite, and of how sometimes justice must arrive on foot and speak in a voice that teaches the stable to be a stable again. Thrace spread itself under a wind that did not apologise, a lean country of scrub and flint, where the shore's foam blew inland to dust the grass with a white that pretended to be snow. And in that hard brightness stood stables that had learned to fear their own doors. Diomedes, king of the Bistones, kept horses there, whose teeth had been taught to forget grain, beasts muscled like arguments, and restless even in sleep, their nostrils inked with the memory of a diet that had made them famous in the way storms are famous. He came ashore not with trumpet or banner, but with the hush of someone listening for a hinge that will tell him which way a gate wishes to swing. The lion's pelt lay like a small knight over his shoulders, and the club felt more walking stick then weapon in the hand of a man already weighing which words might calm a thing that has unlearned calm. Iolaus, faithful as a good idea that keeps returning, walked a few paces behind. The road to Diomedes' hall made a thin brown scar across scrub, and along it the wind wrote its only story, straightforward, without adjectives. The king received them with the pleasantness of a host who believes himself unassailable, his laugh a metal thing. Servants, practised in replacing fear with ceremony, poured wine that smelled of patience turned sour, and the guest, who had learned other men's tempers as carefully as he had learned his own, kept his voice soft, asking to see the famous horses, as if asking for a tour of a chapel. They went. The yard around the stables bore the marks of a place that has entertained grief too often. Ropes plaited thicker than custom requires, posts sunk deep, the ground churned into scars. In the dim, the eyes of the mares shone a hot, incorrect red, and their hooves restlessly stitched the cold into a pattern no one wished to read. Some tellers say their iron diet made them supernatural, others that hunger taught to the wrong appetite becomes its own kind of spell. Either way, the result was the same. Mouths that should have loved oats had been sharpened on the wrong nouns. He tested doors, felt the give of leather, the truth of knots. He greeted grooms who framed their exhaustion as obedience, and nodded to boys who had learned to stand very still when the wind shifted. There is a moment in certain rooms when you know that talk is a blanket too small for the weather. He felt that moment arrive and lifted his eyes to Diomedes, who smiled the thin smile of a man who collects offences as sport. So the breaking began, not with a first blow, but with a first refusal, to be hurried, to be cornered into the theatrics that cruelty loves. He and Iolaus moved like men repairing a floodgate, each gesture containing the next. Ropes ready in loops, remembered from docks and hunts, hands remembering the calm they had practiced on boars and bulls. The yard erupted, screams that sounded like trumpets, bodies slammed against timber, the air itself learning new verbs, and into that clangour poured the Bistones, delighted at last to speak their native tongue. Force. Iolaus took 3 on the left with a speed that felt like a good joke, told at the exact right time. On the right, he himself held a line, not with rage, but with that deliberate pressure a wrestler learns when breath is his metronome. The mares reared and bit at what moved, their lips peeling back to show the cruelty someone had taught them. He waited for the rhythm that every riot confesses, and when it came, push, check, stumble, he fed it rope, trick, patience. Abderus, the bright boy some versions place at his side, eager and fleet, took a halter and led one mare a dozen steps toward daylight before fate remembered its own appetite. Grief makes a shorter story of that part than joy would, and out of respect for the sleeping, we let it be short. The yard learned a new stillness because of what the mares did. He learned another seam of sorrow, and a town on that coast would one day be named to remember a young man's error and courage both. Fury, when turned upon itself, eats quickly. Diomedes tried to make his own stable a theatre for triumph, and discovered that pens are uncertain backdrops. In the crush and scramble he was seized, not roughly, not tenderly, simply with the inevitability reserved for those who have made a profession of wrong, and the circle that had so often watched strangers be pulled down watched their king pass through his own grammar. He did not exult, he did not preach, he let the mares read the sentence that he himself refused to write, and in the violent quiet afterward their breath changed, as if some hot wire behind their eyes had been slackened, and they blinked, confused, as creatures do when a spell unwinds. Sometimes justice is not a blaze, but a sudden removal of heat. He warded them with buckets that had only known panic and watched their throats work, plain and animal again, He fed them grain, cautious handfuls at first, and the soft sound of chewing, which is a kind of forgiveness, began to populate the yard. Ropes at last held without singing, posts relaxed into being merely wood. The wind went back to its old work of explaining distance. When the Bistones found their king smaller than his legend, they arranged their faces into the mask known to all nations, practical sorrow. They helped halter the mares in fours, testing the new quiet as if touching a scar and finding it weather instead. He yoked them not to a blood sport, but to the road, toward the coast and the counting that waited far away, and he made of terror a caravan that learned mile by mile to be only animals. Children, braver than their elders at learning when to stop being afraid, came near enough to smell hide and warm breath. One touched a muzzle, and did not lose her hand to it, and that unremarkable fact blew across the village like a better wind. Some say he left the mares with Eurystheus, who valued trophies over stories. Others, that he turned them loose into fields where they forgot how to carry the wrong grammar in their mouths. What most tellings keep is this, that appetite can be taught back into its proper home, and that the sternest mercy sometimes looks like letting consequences do the teaching. Night came to Thrace suddenly, as if thrown, and the stables, empty of menace, learned again how to be merely buildings that keep the dew off backs. He lay beneath the lion's hood and watched a seam in the roof, let a blade of star in, a thin silver fact proving the rest of the dark was permeable. Sleep brought a different hoofbeat, not the thud of mares, but the measured stride of women, who rode as if the saddle had been invented under them, voices clipped like flint, bracelets speaking when arms moved, a belt at one waist gleaming as if it had remembered a promise to a war god and was keeping it still. He woke with the image sharp as frost, river, plain, horizon, and riders, dark against dawn, and knew, with that knowledge that has no impatience in it, that the next road would angle toward a frontier where courtesy and challenge ride side by side. Somewhere east, the Amazons kept their own city of terms, and the girdle of their queen, call her Hippolyta or Antiope depending on which singer you hire, waited like a question that would not be answered by strength alone. And so while the last stars stepped backward out of the sky, he rose, left the quieted yard to its first ordinary morning in years, and turned his face toward that other shore, where power wears grace and expects to be met in kind. The road to the Amazons drew a long, taut line across plains that spoke in grasses and rivers that told their stories without corners. Rumour went ahead like a herald and returned like a scout, bringing details in fragments, women who rode as if born in the saddle, bows that bent and hummed like harp strings, a queen whose belt shone not with vanity, but with the vow of a god. They called it a girdle, this bright band at Hippolyta's waist, a token Ares had once smiled upon, which is to say it carried more than metal. It carried the weight of consent and the shape of a world that did not need a man's yes to be complete. He approached not as conquerors approach, iron jangling to declare inevitability, but as travellers approach a city they have admired from a distance, hands away from the hilt, eyes level, hearing every small noise as if it were a word. The camp on the river's shoulder was arranged with a grace that belonged to practical minds. Horses picketed where wind would keep the flies lazy, cook fires set so that smoke would travel like quiet news, tents staked in a grid that could unfold into tactics in the time it takes an arrow to breathe. When the queen came forward, the air did not change its temperature, it changed its posture. Hippolyta, some have called her Antiope, the names travel together like twins, who trade necklaces, wore the belt in the manner of those who forget they are wearing crowns, and the women at her shoulder did not stand behind her so much as beside her, in a slightly different rhythm. He bowed, and the bow was not the posture of someone asking a favour. It was the respectful adjustment made by a strong man when he understands he has entered a room that obeys another music and would like to hear it properly. Words in that place moved cleanly. He spoke of the errand that had braided him to a small king's ledger, of labours meant to mend what strength had once broken, of a girdle desired not as a trophy to hang on a wall, but as a hard coin of proof to pay a promissory note, demanded by gods and men. Hippolyta listened without hurry, the way a river listens to a stone that wishes to cross. Her face carried the calm of one who has learned that fear and courtesy wear different sandals. She asked the questions that tested not his arms but his aim. What would the belt mean when torn from its context, whether taking, politely or otherwise, can ever pretend to be the same as sharing, whether a man's proof must always be a woman's absence? He found himself answering with a clarity earned in marsh and stable and sure, that what he loved best in victories lately was the quiet they left behind. That proof has begun to seem like noise when compared to the soft arithmetic of safety returned. That he would turn away empty-handed rather than turn this camp into an echo of one more place where men mistook justification for fate. Perhaps the gods listened. Perhaps only women did. Either way, the air agreed in some subtler medium. Hippolyta's hand moved to the belt in a gesture that was neither surrender nor indulgence. It was the gesture of someone choosing a story in which both parties keep their dignity, and she spoke of a trade so old it arrives looking new. A pledge for a pledge. He would take the girdle as symbol to show a distant court the amplitude of Amazon grace, and in return he would leave more than thanks. He would leave the promise that in halls where men sharpened myths, he would tell of a people whose strength did not require mirrors to be believed. It might have ended there, under an afternoon that forgot to be dramatic, but Hera's patience has teeth, and in some tellings the goddess moved a rumour through the camp the way wind moves fire, a whisper that the stranger's courtesy was a mask, that behind his soft words waited the old machine of siege. Panic, once invited, knows the alphabet of haste. The perimeter clenched, bows lifted, battle cry rose from throats that had never needed to be loud to be convincing. He felt it like a change in weather, and stood still in the only courage he trusted now, the stillness that refuses to let fear do its favourite trick of rearranging facts. Hippolyta's eyes slid half a degree, enough to register the lie, as if it were a draught in a house whose windows she had closed herself. For a few cruel breaths, violence rehearsed. Then she cut it short with a palm turned down, the old sign that commands both horse and heart to settle. We do not let other people's storms choose our harvest, is how one singer remembers her sentence. He answered by setting his club deliberately on the ground, a heavy period that allowed the paragraph to conclude. The archers, who had already measured the distances and felt the pleasurable ache beginning in their backs, unstrung without complaint. War, they knew, is less beautiful up close than songwriters pretend. And so the belt changed waists not as a spoil but as a guest, and when he fastened it over the lion's hide, the metal felt less like victory than like a reminder to be careful with the grammar of power. There was feasting without alcohol's brag, meat that honoured the animals by not wasting them, stories traded like blankets shared on a cold bank. He watched the Amazons teach their daughters the exacting kindness of saddle and bow, the patience of grooming, the mathematics of formation that lets comradeship harden into protection without growing brittle. In the morning he left the token not in a chest, but in the space between their camp and himself, visible acknowledged, a promise embodied in brass. Hippolyta rode with him for a span, river to one side, open step to the other, and their silence felt like two good tools sharing a wall. When at last she turned, the horse beneath her braided light into each stride, and he watched until distance took her from sight, the way sleep takes a thought that will be waiting when you wake. The return to Eurystheus carried with it the usual theatre, heralds balancing tongues on scales, courtiers performing surprise as if it were a difficult dance, but the small king's eyes flickered with an irritation that lamps cannot cure. He was learning, against his will, that a man who comes back alive from places kings have not seen brings into a court a different temperature, and that objects fetched from afar can carry climates of their own. The girdle on the table made a soft ring, a sound not of victory but of a system agreeing, just for a moment, to be wider than usual. He did not linger. The ledger flipped to the next page almost by itself, as ledgers do when restless hands hold them, and the rumour that found him on the porch smelled of sun-baked stone and long horizons, a red island at the world's shoulder, where a triple-bodied shepherd named Geryon kept cattle the colour of evening, and a hound who hated trespass, where the road would not be measured in days, but in thirst and patience, and where even the sky seemed to stand farther away. He tightened the strap of the borrowed token across his chest and turned west, chasing a sunset he would have to catch in his hands, while somewhere behind him a ring of hooves faded along a riverbank and a queen's camp folded itself neatly, like a thought returned to the mind's quiet shelf. Westward he walked until maps thinned into rumour and rumour into red stone, the sun laying a copper hand on his neck each afternoon, as if to weigh resolve, and nights unbuttoned themselves slowly, exposing larger and larger stars. There is a kind of distance that stretches a man without unspooling him, and he learned it there, on roads that preferred horizon to milestone. Somewhere beyond the familiar blue, they said, lay Erythea, a sunset-coloured island at the hinge of the world, where Geryon, triple, in the way mountains are triple, at dawn, crest, shadow, echo, kept cattle the shade of late embers, guarded by a hound with two mouths for the same anger, and a herdsman who had practised saying no until it sounded like weather. Water made an obstacle of itself for a while, shouldering a long coast that looked the same after 3 days as after 30. He slept in olive groves that do not care about quests. He traded words with fishermen whose nets knew more truth than courts. And when the heat learned to sit still at noon, he found a rock and let silence borrow his breath. On a day when even lizards walked slower, the sun watched him with the fond curiosity reserved for stubborn guests, and, amused perhaps by a mortal who would not treat the edge of the world as a warning, lent him, say the older mouths, a golden cup, a shallow craft the size of a large idea, in which night crossings became possible. He set the club across the gleam as a mast in miniature, and let the sea's long muscle carry him. The cup moved without wake, the way acceptance moves, and gulls that knew every boat forgot to comment, as if this were a kindness they had agreed to keep quiet. Wind licked salt into his beard. In his chest something unclenched that had been clenched since Delphi. Not relief exactly, but a recognition that even labours sometimes allow a man to be carried. Erythea rose like a coal exhaled by the sun. The hound greeted him first, Orthrus, double-headed and singular in purpose, rushing across scrub that wore the colour of old clay. He did not waste a speech on the creature any more than storms waste speeches on roofs. The club's arc was a dark comma, precise, and the sentence of that danger ended without flourish. Then Eurytion, the herdsman, came with a spear and a face trained by years of maintaining someone else's perimeter, and there, because some stories need compassion to function, he offered talk. A man who watches cattle at the rim of the world has learned patience, but patience can be braided with pride. Words frayed, then broke, and grief took a short, necessary breath. The red herd lifted their beautiful horns and stared with the steady regard that animals give the weather, alert, fearless, uninterested in politics. He turned them shoreward, not with whips, but with the unbent line of his own stride, and for a heartbeat the island seemed to become a bowl in a larger hand, and the hand turned, and the herd flowed, slowly, reluctantly, inevitably, toward the cup. But Geryon, who in some tellings is a single grief with three bodies, and in others three griefs persuaded to share a single will, appeared then on the ridge, bronze spitting sunlight, belts crossing a chest that had learned to be many. Arrows make equal sentences of most disputes. His flew true, with the Lerna memory whispering at their tips, and the great shepherd folded along plains the eye could not quite follow, as if a mountain decided to remember it was only rock. The island held the silence that follows when an old rule kept mainly by habit has been rewritten by a quieter law. He made no boast. The sea had already begun its long tug inward, the daily rehearsal of disappearance, and he guided the herd into the shining vessel, which took them not so much aboard as into its idea, the way a story, told wide enough, can hold more than seems possible. Night ferried them, dawn poured them back onto continental patience. Bringing cattle home is always less dramatic than the reasons that sent you to fetch them. Hooves learn domestic time, drink, graze, stand, consider, and men, walking beside them, learn a matching arithmetic. But Hera, faithful to her own script, sent a gadfly thin as a thread, maddening as memory, to scribble panic through the red backs. The herd tore itself across a plain into 100 wrong directions, and he spent a long passage of days unlearning dispersion, whistling low, clapping slow, reminding near animals what near means until far animals could remember it too. He built a river of patience down which the scattered would choose, one by one, to drift, and when finally the last horn winked back into the count, the landscape itself seemed to exhale as barns do at dusk in lands that have never learned his name. There were other interludes the songs mention, Cacus in a smoky cave, where theft learned to walk backward, a king along the way who thought guest right applied to wealth, but not to work, an altar raised where the road grew generous. But these the old singers keep brief, as if protecting the hush of an evening in which the herd at last stood quiet under a sky the colour of its own hides. He washed in a ford that translated mountain into plain and knelt a moment, not pious so much as grateful for the exact neutrality of water. When he reached the small king with cattle intact, the court played at surprise, and then at boredom, both of which are easier than respect. He simply counted aloud a shepherd's litany until numbers did what numbers do, squeeze ambiguity until it finds another room. The ledger added a neat mark, but he felt no notch cut into himself. He had not shrunk to fit the task, nor had he grown monstrous to overtop it. He slept that night under a sycamore that kept, in its cool shade, the smell of milk. Strange comfort for a man who had held so many kinds of breath in his hands. And when he dreamed, it was of fruit beyond a far garden wall, the air there tasting of resin and dusk, a dragon coiled not against him, but around a promise, apples the sun had taught to keep a little of its light for evening. He woke with the flavour of pines on his tongue and the image of a titan shrugging a sky back into place, like a cloak slipping from the shoulder. East west, it hardly mattered now. The world had begun to curve toward the next necessity, and somewhere, beyond a line of dark cypresses, maidens were keeping a cool vigil among leaves that did not tire, and a whisper like bracelets touching told him that the road, courteous and insistent, was turning toward the garden that keeps its own night. He went looking for a garden that keeps twilight in its leaves, a place where the air tastes of resin and evening even at noon, and where apples, they say, remember the sun so faithfully that they shine with it long after daylight drops its coins into the west. Some call it the garden of the Hesperides, daughters of the evening who tend what cannot be bought, and at its edges coils a dragon, laden, whose patience is scaled, and whose song, if it can be called that, sounds like branches rubbing together in a wind that never quite arrives. To reach such a place, he learned to ask the world gently to show him its seams. He questioned old men who had warmed their bones on doorsteps that face west, nymphs whose laughter carried the map of rivers, a sea god, Nereus, whose answers came like fish slipping from the hand until a careful grip turned slipperiness into guidance. He travelled past lands where the goats wore bells that made of hillside a music, through valleys where shepherds traced constellations with their staffs for children drowsing under cloaks, and along coasts that had memorized the steps of travellers and could, if asked, repeat them. The lion's pelt learned the smell of many kinds of pine. His bowstring learned the dryness of high altitudes and the salt of sudden squalls. When he was uncertain, he did what he had been taught by quieter teachers. He sat, he breathed, he listened for the thin note a world makes when it wishes to be understood. In certain tellings he found the old man of the sea asleep, and held him through a calculus of shapes, eel, fire, tree, beast, until truth chose to stop wriggling. In others, a river, pleased to be flattered, leaned its course just enough to point a traveller toward a night that did not move. At the mountain's shoulder, where the air goes thin with clarity, he met the great silhouette of endurance, Atlas, standing under the world's round patience as if it were a yoke he had chosen. Whether the Titan's eyes were kind or merely relieved to find a new sentence to read is a matter for singers who enjoy tiny differences. What matters is that they spoke without hatred and found between them a workable grace. Heracles told of a small king's large ledger and of a garden walled not by stone but by the logic of belonging. Atlas told of daughters whose song tastes of dusk, and of a dragon who knew no boredom, only vigilance. "Let me fetch the apples," said Atlas, stretching a shrug that moved a little weather, "and you, for a while, hold what I hold." There are labours that ask the back a question. This was one. He took the sky, the way one takes a sleeping child from a tired mother, not to claim, but to straddle a moment for another's ease, and the weight settled like a long cord across his shoulders. It did not crush. It insisted, like duty, like grief carried properly, like love that is not a fever but a practice. The few breaths passed between them like respectful messengers. Atlas stepped away, and the world did not fall. It merely shifted, redistributing its old arithmetic along a new column. Time slowed into a careful syrup. Birds, far below, rehearsed arguments with their own reflections on water. A cloud dragged its loose hem across a distant ridge. The sun, patient accountant, slid one bead down the wire of the afternoon. He thought of other weights he had held, boars against ravines, hides that refused knives, the anger of mares taught wrong appetites, and found that none had this specific, almost tender authority. He listened, and the sky hummed back a note that said, "Be still." Atlas returned at last with apples nested in his palms like small suns that were practicing setting, golden, yes, but more than gold, as if the tree had stored 1,000 afternoons and let each fruit keep a thimbleful. In some songs, the Titan, pleased with his errand, proposed a trade of forever. He would carry the apples to Eurystheus. Heracles could keep the world. In others, he simply hesitated to resume what he had grown used to not feeling. Our teller tonight prefers the version in which courtesy remembers cleverness without making a boast of it. "Just a moment," said Heracles, voice level. "Hold this again, while I settle the cushion on my shoulders. One does not wish to offend the firmament with clumsiness." A pride which loves to be useful when praised reached out, and in that courteous instant the old balance returned. The weight found its original shelf. Atlas stood once more under his lifelong sentence and discovered, with surprise that had no bitterness in it, that continuity can be a kind of comfort. He handed over the fruit with the mildness of a man giving a guest something the house can spare. Somewhere very far away, in a garden that does not keep score, Lerna coiled around silence, the way ivy coils around a remembered pillar, and the Hesperides sang again. Not sad, not glad, simply evening. Other tellings lay a different path beneath his sandals. In those, he reached the orchard's edge himself and spoke to the dragon, as one speaks to old guardians who do not read petitions. He matched patience to patience until the coils forgot their purpose, or he let arrows heavy with Lerna's old logic teach a serpent the ending proper to mortals, or he listened to the Hesperides and took what was offered because the manner of asking had been correct. The variations make their own gentle weather, and scholars, who enjoy measuring steps a hero took that cannot have been taken in one life, debate quietly over wine that softens conclusions. He, for his part, did not argue with versions. He carried the apples the way one carries a lantern between houses at night, carefully, knowing the flame is more than light. It is also the promise that hands will not be empty when doors open. The walk back moved through ordinary fields that seemed brighter, simply because he had seen a place where brightness is a property, not a visitor. Children, not knowing more than their eyes tell them, pointed and tugged at sleeves. Old women, who know that gods hide in work clothes, shook their heads and smiled the way one smiles at a rumour that might be true enough. He did not taste the fruit. He did not even touch them more than needed. Sometimes reverence is merely the good manners a mortal keeps in the presence of something that will outlast him. At court, the small king's hands hovered and then drew back, as if afraid of being corrected by light. The ledger acquired its neat mark, and the room, briefly, learned how to be quiet without feeling diminished. Night found him beneath a cypress that had practiced stillness for 100 years. He laid the apples on a folded cloak and watched them think, which is to say, they glowed a little, and moths came by to consider them as if the fruit were flowers that had decided to keep their petals. He slept and dreamed, not of gardens, but of thresholds, of a hillside, where the grass grows thin and the ground begins to hum in a lower key, of doorways cut into earth where breath mists and then is taken away to be counted elsewhere, of a dog with 3 heads whose eyes keep different kinds of watch. He woke with the quiet certainty that comes after a long curve in a road, and the dawn tasted unmistakably of stone and echo. Ahead lay a descent, not to conquer, but to ask permission, a last errand that would require a man to step gently into another sovereign's house and to return with his hands clean. And somewhere beneath the morning, a river rolled its dark shoulder, unhurried, as if reminding him that even heroes cross certain waters as guests. He set out before the sun had quite remembered its duties, walking toward a hill whose grass is thinned into the hush that always gathers near old doors. There are thresholds that the world keeps modest, so the proud will miss them. And this was one, a cleft in rock shaped by patient water, a breath of cool air that smelled faintly of iron and fennel, a stone that, when touched, seemed to record rather than echo. He had been told, not by braggarts, but by those who know the cost of asking, that the house below was orderly, sovereign, and complete unto itself, and that any mortal who entered must behave as a guest behaves when invited into a temple, hands open, voice low, promises exact. Some say Hermes met him there where the light first faltered, staff like a polite line drawn between realms, and that Athena, who respects measured courage, gave a look that steadies more than any armour. Others, preferring a sterner solitude, imagine him descending alone, with only the lion's pelt to remember sunlight for him. He left blades and boasting at the lip of earth, keeping only the club as a pilgrim's staff, and the old habit of breathing in fours, the way discipline counts itself. The path short and sound, and soon the world was speaking in vowels, held longer than the throat expects. Drip, hum, the distant grinding of time on stone. Shades drew near in that soft curiosity reserved for the newly alive among them. He listened because the dead have a way of telling truths that daylight forgets to keep. A few reached as if to greet a rumour. One, say the singers, wore the look of a friend tangled in a chair that forgives no visitor. Theseus exacted from a promise made too boldly, and with a strength that apologized while using itself, he hauled the hero free from a seat that eats memory. The river there moved like night pretending to be water, and its ferryman weighed him in a stare. The coin he offered was not metal, but permission, granted by a queen who knew what must sometimes be borrowed for the world to right itself, and by a king who understands contracts. He crossed. The banks did not change, yet everything had altered. Colours lowered their voices, smells leaned towards stone and laurel, and even his footfall wore felt. He bowed where bowing was right, to Hades, whose justice is not cold but temperatureless, to Persephone, whose eyes remember winter and spring without preferring either, to the bureaucracy of death that, while feared on earth, is loved below for keeping grief from dissolving into chaos. He stated the errand as a craftsman describes a commission: no flourish, no bargain, only the clean lines of a request, to take the hound as proof that penance obeys as strictly as it demands, and to return him unharmed. The lord of that house, who has no need to impress anyone, agreed on the oldest condition, that nothing sharp be used, and that the guardian be met as a guardian deserves, by strength with courtesy, by courage that does not insult a task well done. He stepped back from the throne, felt the ground adjust under the weight of consent, and followed a faint draught that carried the dog's threefold breath. Cerberus came as horizons do, first as rumour, then as fact, three heads sharing one patience, manes matted with the spray of a river that forgets no name, eyes lit not with malice, but with an attention so thorough that men call it fear. He did not raise the club. He loosened the lion's hood, as one might loosen a collar before lifting, rolled his shoulders until they remembered Atlas, and waited for the first necessary lunge. It came from the left, quick, testing, and he offered the forearm, wrapped in hide, not as bait, but as promise, that he would answer in the same language. The middle head, slowest because it thinks, moved an instant later, and with that stutter of difference, he stepped inside the knot. Arms he had used to shape rivers and hold horizons found a hold just behind the triple jaw's hinge, where force can be read rather than felt. He did not crush, he contained. Breath by breath he turned rage into labour, a wrestling the old gymnasia would have called honest. No trick knives, no gods, humming secret advantages, only a man remembering that the body can be a door others pass through safely. The right head, angriest because it keeps children from what they want, thrashed hard enough to make stones reconsider their positions. He shifted a knee, lowered his centre, and let the ground take half the battle. A minute is a long time when measured by heartbeats that might be the last. Then the long tremor became a shudder. The shudder became a breath, and breath, marvellously, remembered it could be calm. He relaxed without letting go, and the dog's 3 attentions, finding no insult in the grip, gave him the old professional courtesy one guardian shows another. Guided rather than dragged, the hound followed through colonnades of shadow where poplars kept their own weather, past meadows where figures moved, as if rehearsing lighter versions of their heaviest days. At the threshold closest to light, he paused to let eyes adjust that had not needed to in an age. Persephone's gaze, they say, touched the scene like frost that blesses wheat. Hades' slight nod made a complete sentence of the agreement, and the ferryman, who seldom smiles, arranged his mouth in a way that did not contradict one. Above, the day flexed, astonished to see such a guest. Eurystheus, faced with proof that does not negotiate, hid in the nearest architecture of dignity, and courtiers learned the difficult etiquette of awe. He did not parade the hound like conquest. He let the mighty animal stand a moment in open air, nostrils flaring with the shock of wind that has forgotten its limits, and then, with the same care one uses in returning a borrowed tool unchipped, he walked Cerberus back to the cool that is his office. No trumpets, no lecture, only a return. The underworld received its sentinel with the quiet satisfaction of a house whose door fits perfectly again. He thanked that realm in the language it honours, precise bows, measured silence, and climbed, measuring the return not in steps but in the way colour grows slowly richer, in the way the air remembers to taste of time and dust and mortal heat. Scholars, gentle when the night is long, dispute whether this labour was last or merely largest, whether his errands ended here or only changed shape. What they agree on is the look often noticed on the faces of those who have visited an honest border and come back, the look of someone who will never again confuse noise for majesty. He reached the world that counts years and bread, and for a while he walked without purpose, louder than listening, the lion's pelt suddenly lighter, the club suddenly only wood. Far off, on a river whose name is also a prophecy, a ferryman dipped his oar and did not look up. Near at hand, a swallow tried out 3 different songs before choosing the one the evening wanted. And just ahead, though he could not yet know the shape of it, another door waited in sunlight, disguised as a love that would need saving and become, by very human accident, the arrow that points toward an ending bright enough to be mistaken for mercy. He did not go home so much as he widened the circle of what home could mean. Roads unspooled, seas repeated themselves like reassuring hymns, and the world showed its other faces the way a mountain shows new profiles to a walker who keeps choosing different paths around it. Freed of the ledger, but not of the habit of mending, he answered troubles, as one answers a door with the lamp already in hand. In Libya, they say, a wrestler named Antaeus greeted travellers with a smile that was really a trap, drawing life from the earth each time his back touched it. Heracles learned to lift him into air and keep him there, a lesson as quiet as it was stern. Some strengths bloom only in certain soils, and mercy is not the same as leaving a harm unlearned. In Egypt, a priest-king called Busiris tried to prove that hospitality and knives could share an altar. The tethered oxen watched a stranger cut the cords of that argument without letting piety bleed. Between those episodes, the roads were slow with ordinary kind talk. Women, asking if the lion's pelt was warm in rain as well as in snow, boys begging to feel the weight of the club and laughing at how it made their wrists ring, old men under porticos pressing him for stories that sounded in their mouths like instructions for living through winter. He told what he could, without boasting, and left out what would have tasted of smoke. There is a way of carrying fame that does not bruise the fruit it passes. He tried for that way, and often came close. Far in the north, where the light stretches itself thin to make a longer afternoon, he found a chain eating into a god's ankle, and a vulture busy at a sentence that never reached its period. Prometheus, who had loved men enough to defy the sky with a bright theft, lifted his face and practiced the difficult art of gratitude that has not yet turned into bitterness. An arrow learned the measure of the bird's throat. Iron learned to open when persuaded by strong, patient hands. The Titan stood, not proudly, but with the relief of someone allowed to change posture after too many years. And Heracles, who had once carried the firmament for a span, nodded with the shy solidarity of labourers who recognise one another in silence. Small gods along the road, river mouths with local tempers, caves with shrines as neat as a careful pantry, seemed to breathe easier for a season, and shepherds who had not noticed the tightness under their ribs noticed it release. He never said aloud that freedom has a smell. He thought it did, resin mixed with cool iron, because some truths work better as weather than as law. It was during these gentler circuits that desire, which had always kept pace like a shadow, stepped forward and asked to be counted. He met Deianira in a city whose streets knew how to hold music, and whose windows learned their weather from a careful river. She spoke as if words should leave room for breath, and she wore courage in the modest way good wool wears dye, deep even, true without show. The hands found a temperature that could be kept, and if his past had taught him that storms like to borrow the names of blessings, his present asked him to believe that not every door opened by love leads to a room on fire. They travelled together until a river said no in its spring voice. Nessus, a ferryman whose back and manners were both half horse, offered to carry her, and in mid-crossing tried to make of a favour a theft. The arrow that remembered Lerna remembered its duty again. Nessus learned what consequences feel like when they arrive with excellent aim, and dying, he crafted a future out of spite and pitch, offering Deianira a charm soaked in the wrong memory, promising fidelity with a recipe that would one day try to turn love into law. The vial waited in the quiet of a chest. Time, which sometimes heals and sometimes seasonings, kept walking. There were feasts too, rooms filled with the good exhaustion of people who had put their fields in order for the season, songs that carry the smoke of cooking fires the way hair remembers a long day, girls who braided laurels into the lion's mane when he let it lie beside him like a sleeping dog, boys who wanted to see if they could drag the club 2 steps without giving up. Some could, and were praised for their breath more than for their reach. He found that praise, when measured like flour instead of flung like confetti, makes a steadier bread. He listened to debates conducted in the polite theatre of dice boards and wine cups, whether men become good because gods smile, or gods smile because men become good, whether sorrow should be carried on the shoulder or in the hand, whether a city is a wall, a contract, or a habit of keeping one another from falling. He rarely decided these arguments for anyone but himself, and even then, gently. But in another city, a king named Eurytus kept a bowstring stretched tight with pride. His daughter Iole moved through rooms like the idea of morning learning to stand, and admiration, which has the decency to arrive first, took its seat before desire, which often arrives thoughtless and late. A boast became an insult a contest, and when words failed to escort Tempter safely back to its stall, events began to run without bridle. Iphitus, a friend, followed him to a high place in a gesture that looked, from the ground, like trust. The high place answered with a silence that did not absolve gravity, and grief took up residence in Heracles, with the terrible efficiency of a guest who knows where the house keeps its cups. Delphi was a long road away, but remorse has better legs than men. At the tripod, he learned again that penance is not a game one plays only once. He served, in some tellings, beneath a foreign woman's stern household, and learned the difficult courtesies that keep a strong hand from becoming a clumsy one. In other tellings, he quarrelled foolishly with meanings, and very nearly tried to steal a god's instrument to force a different sentence from fate. Either way, he came back to himself with the tired gratitude of a man who has been forgiven by the very order he tried to rearrange. Home, whatever circumference that word now drew, smelled of cedar chests and ground grain. Deianira, wise enough to feel the current beneath the talk of guests, measured the look that passed between her husband and an idea named Iola, and reached for the small bottle a dying ferryman had offered, as if offering help. Love is a craft, so is panic. She soaked a fine tunic with the mixture, believing she was patching a roof before the rain. She laid it where a hand she trusted would find it. She prayed, if praying is the word for private weather, that Fidelity might be coaxed like a shy cat back into the house, and that no one would notice the coaxing. He dressed for a sacrifice that asked for cleanliness, and arrived wearing an argument he did not know he had put on. At first, heat smells like purity. Then it smells like warning. Then it smells like what it is. We will not stand in that square just yet. We will not watch men scatter with jars of water that behave like theatre props, nor listen to a hero make the sound iron makes when it learns fire has a second name, because the night has its own tenderness to keep. For now, we will leave him on a threshold he does not deserve, and perhaps cannot avoid, the lion's hood in his hands like a question he is not ready to ask, the river below the city pretending, in the dusk, to be Mercury laid out flat for someone to read. And if the stars look closer than they were the week before, it is because endings draw the ceiling down to teach us how to whisper. The day chosen for a clean fire began like any other generous morning, with breeze moving over fields as if blessing the grain one stalk at a time, and a sky that seemed to believe in beginnings even when it knew better. He dressed without ceremony, accepting from careful hands the fine tunic that smelled faintly of chest and cedar, the cloth light as a promise, and, in places, a little stiff where dye had dried. There is a moment when the body, wiser than pride, whispers to the mind that something is wrong, the seam tight where it should flow, the heat rising too quickly through fabric meant to breathe. And he felt it then, a small alarm ringing in a hallway far from the ear, far. At first he mistook it for nerves a man sometimes feels when he means to thank gods thoroughly. Then the warmth found teeth, and those teeth learned the map of his skin with a malice made not of intention but of mixture, the way certain herbs become medicine in one pot and poison in another. He tried to undress politely, the way one removes a gift without insulting the giver. The cloth answered by clinging with a lover's logic gone feral, tightening exactly where fingers reached to loosen, brightening its own wicked embroidery where heat licked fastest. Men hurried, with water that steamed into theatre. Hands that had hauled bores and opened rivers remembered, with a child's humiliation, the helplessness of pain that refuses to be reasoned with. And somewhere, across a few streets, but already an age away, Deianira watched the same morning tear a seam in its own cloth. The small bottle's memory rose like smoke around her, Nessus's voice arriving with that sweet clarity spite sometimes wears. And grief, clean, exact, walked into her house and sat down with neither apology nor appetite. She went where some women go when they discover that love, meant to be a salve, has turned to lime. The city would speak of that doorway in a lower register for years. He did not rage at her name. He spoke at once, they said, as a man speaks a spring's name, when, thirsting, he realizes he has been drinking from a mirror. Pain begged for a simpler grammar. He called for air, for height. The instinct that mountains have taught men since the first fever, that higher ground makes sense of heat. Carried or limping, the stories differ. What they share is the long lift toward Oeta, a slope that knew his foot already and seemed, in its rocky patience, willing to hold what the day refused to carry. Pines made their tall, sober music. Stones remembered storms without showing off. Wind gathered what sweat could no longer tell and threw it wide, useless and yet somehow companionable. At a shelf of rock where the world steps back to see itself, he asked for wood, not the quick litter of brush that flatters flame into greed, but logs that demand thought, a square-limbed pyre that makes of burning a rite rather than a riot. Friend's hands shook with the terror of doing a last task well. His voice made the small, steady corrections carpenters make when they love both house and weather. More air here, tighter there, lay the branches not like swords, but like rafters that mean to hold. He climbed, as one climbs, into a vessel made of bright necessity, and looked out once upon a country he had spent years turning from complaint into ordinary mourning, fields washed by borrowed rivers, stables that echoed properly, lakes where iron no longer fell from the air, roads that learned laughter again. A wind ran its cool finger down his brow, and for a breath the pain dimmed enough to let gratitude see the room. He asked, nobody remembers if quietly or with the old sound, in the language that friends understand best. Finish it for me. Their eyes argued with their hands. Men who had built their courage using his measurements found their rulers no use. Then a stranger stepped forward, or a friend, or a boy who became a friend in that step. Some call him Poeas, archer of Trachis, others Philoctetes, yet to inherit the bow. Whoever he was, he knew the heavier kindness and touched flame to kindling, the way one touches a brow to give a blessing, brief, exact, final. Fire, once authorized, performed its ancient office without pride. The lion's pelt, last companion of so many thresholds, drew back from heat as if understanding that its work had ended. Smoke braided upward in sentences too smooth for grief to interrupt, and the body that had been an argument for strength became, very slowly, an eloquence of light. In that widening brightness, say the gentler mouths, the old tunic finally let go. The pain loosened its grip enough to salute, and the air around the pyre ceased to be only air. It became a door stood open by someone on the other side. If, in that moment, the mountain seemed taller, it is because the sky stepped closer to meet it. If thunder rolled without weather, perhaps it was the gods learning reverence for a man who had practiced it so stubbornly on earth. What comes after, in the noble versions, is not an ending but a turn. They say a cloud came low like a ship, ready for a particular passenger. They say the bright lanes of heaven remembered a child nursed problematically on divine milk, and now chose, with a surprising tenderness, to call him citizen rather than guest. He woke, if waking is the word we dare, beneath a light that does not squint, on a threshold where anger's old wire no longer ran under the skin. The bough that had carried poison forgot its dark grammar. Hands found themselves without weight or wound. A young goddess, Hebe, fresh as rinsed dawn, met him with the quiet smile of one who understands repairs, and wedding songs learned to move at a slower tempo, respectful of the smoke still folding itself into ether below. If the table there poured different wine, he drank it without comparing. If the seats faced a wider horizon, he sat with the posture of those who have learned that victory, when it finally tells the truth, is another word for service. But not every telling climbs so easily. Some, careful with splendour, keep their eyes on the mountain until only ash and rumour are left. They follow the club to a clear place beside the pyre, where it cooled and remembered it had always been wood. They trace the men down the slope, each step learning the weight of absence that walks just behind the heel. They enter houses where women bind hair and say names under their breath, and they admit that cities go on, as cities must, making markets and laws in the shadow of a fire that asks them to redefine glory. Scholars, whose kindness is their willingness to disagree gently, argue about dates and altars, about which towns kept the truer rite, about where the first festival dared to call his name divine without flinching. Yet even their footnotes cannot keep the smoke from rising again each time the story is told, nor keep a hush from moving, feather soft, through a listener's room. Night drew its clean sheet over Oeta. The wind, having done its duty, went lower on the scale and practiced being a lullaby. Down in the valleys, the cattle coughed the hay-scented cough of contentment. On coasts far away, oars struck water in an unshowy rhythm. In halls where a small king had once kept a mean ledger, the ink dried and no one cared. And somewhere, in a garden that keeps its evening in polished leaves, or in a portico where philosophers reckon with kindness, or on a road where a boy tries to lift a stranger's heavy stick just to see, something of him walked on, lighter, not absent. Tomorrow we will follow those traces where argument gives way to evidence, where potsherds and metopes and patient lines of verse keep faith with a life that flickers between myth and memory. And for now, the mountain breathes, sending up one last warm ribbon into a sky that seems, for an instant, to glow from within. By daylight, his story feels like sunlight caught in stone. By lamplight, it becomes the rustle of paper and the low hum of voices reading lines, older than the rooms that hold them. If a listener leans closer, evidence begins to glow. Quiet, steady, uninsistent. A traveller named Pausanias walks through the 2nd century like a patient guest, noting what temples remember when priests grow tired. At Olympia, he lists the metopes, where each labour stands in carved relief, muscle taught to speak marble, club curving like a half-finished moon. At Thebes, he remarks on shrines that keep a local grammar of Heracles, intimate as family talk. In places where the sea salts everything, he points to altars, whose smoke drifts toward islands that once needed a bull to be walked gently home. The pages do not shout. They keep minutes. Earlier still, poets lean in. Hesiod, in a voice like autumn grain pouring, and Homer, whose hexameters fold a figure named Heracles into a world busy with other wars. Later, Euripides composes a room full of grief and calls it Heracles the Mad. Sophocles lays a careful fire beneath a story and names it Women of Trachis, letting Deianeira's hands tremble over a tunic we already know will burn. Apollodorus, that librarian of myth, arranges the labours into a shelf anyone can reach. Their texts are the steps of a stone stair, worn by use, dependable, each holding the weight of a century without complaint. Archaeology adds its softer lanterns. In museum glass, a black figure amphora shows him and Athena sharing a breath between battles, the goddess's hand a brief rest for the world's shoulders. A kylix bowl captures the Nemean wrestle in a tight circle of lines, as if the artist wanted to drink from courage nightly. A red figure hydria, paint thin as a remembered song, lets a hydra's neck braid across the curve, while a small painted Iolaus carries fire like a solution, coins, bronze, faithful to commerce, stamp club and bow and lion skin onto palms that will buy bread, suggesting that strength, to be trusted, must live in markets as well as in poems. Stone speaks with the patience of weather. The Olympia metopes still teach restraint in the set of a jaw, design in the angle of a hip, and the Farnese Hercules, a Roman echo of Greek idea, rests on his club, apples behind his back, like an old joke that still warms the table. Even chipped noses and broken fingers serve the tale. Damage proves devotion, the way a thumb-worn rosary proves midnight. Inscriptions hold his many names like beads: Heracles Kalinikos, beautiful in victory; Heracles Alexikakos, averter of evil; Heracles Patronos, protector; and in Rome the Latin turns the vowels and calls him Hercules Invictus, inviter of labours, beneficiary of citizens who want to be braver than their errands. Altars at the Ara Maxima breathe a Roman confidence, yet a small Theban stele, scratched by a hand that had dirt under its nails, prays for a good harvest with the same gravity. Between empire and stove, the same figure appears, slightly altered by accent and appetite, like a melody sung by different throats across a river at dusk. Even the ordinary tools of worship bear quiet witness: terracotta votives in the shape of hands and knees, offered by bodies that have learned to ask help for the parts that carry them; oil flasks painted with the little domestic moments of a hero's long afternoons, binding, washing, feeding a tame calm into a frightened animal. Scholars lean in around these objects as friends lean over a map at night. They argue gently about origin, seeing Near Eastern shadows at the edges of the earliest scenes, a lion slayer who might have wandered west with motifs in his bag. They disagree softly about the labour's number and order, whether the story's spine was always 12, or whether time, tidy as librarians, reshelved scattered feats into a dozen because the calendar likes symmetry. They speak about cult and theatre, about hero as border keeper between wildness and town, about a mortal son of a god becoming a god, not merely as reward, but because the city needed a citizen of heaven who understood work. When they reach the question of history, their voices lower without surrendering to cynicism. No, there is no Heracles to footnote, as one would footnote a general's campaign. Yes, there is a Heracles to footnote as one footnotes bread, pervasive, sustaining, ordinary and extraordinary at once, a diet of image and ideal that keeps centuries from thinning into weather. In the margins of these debates, archaeologists sweep with soft brushes and find a small bronze club where a river curled. Conservators glue back a flake of slip that restores the shine to a painted muscle. A graduate student notes a graffito to Heracles who helped, and feels for a second the old warmth move like tea through winter fingers. Evidence even keeps its own lullaby in the way museums fall quiet after closing. In those minutes, glass cases stop performing and simply companion the things inside them. The lion's skin looks less like costume and more like memory. A fragment of metopo appears to inhale. The Farnese Hercules, tired of being heroic, seems merely thoughtful. Somewhere, a curator leaves the side door and checks the lock twice, the same way shepherds check gates. Somewhere else, a janitor pauses beside a coin display and shakes his head at how small a thunderbolt becomes when you can hold it between finger and thumb. Meanwhile, in a sanctuary where worship continues, a candle burns to a wick and decides to go on anyway, a thin conviction drawing a brave line of gold down a brass holder. And in all these rooms, that old companionable idea survives, that stories are not a luxury. They are a kind of infrastructure, the road between grief and meaning, the bridge between power and restraint. If a listener wants one last proof, there is this. Children keep learning the names of beasts in their right order, lion, hydra, hind, long before they meet the words metope or Apollodorus. The body remembers before the library does. Later, when the library finally speaks, it only confirms what the pulse has known, that a life squared off against chaos can be told as muscle and club, but must also be told as patience, apology, and the clever mercy of rerouting a river instead of drowning in it. And so when we lay text beside marble, coin beside cup, altar beside stage, a face comes into focus, not perfect, not consistent, but kind enough to keep the world company while it works. Outside the last gallery, evening waits with its clean pockets and its steadying cool. Somewhere beyond these careful rooms, the tale is still being retold with newer instruments, ink turning to celluloid, celluloid to pixels, the club traded for a microphone, the lion's pelt for a green screen, each era dressing his endurance to fit its own mirrors. And as the doors click shut, a poster in a cinema lightbox hums to itself, promising a familiar figure in a different tint. The same labours, brighter, louder, faster, while somewhere else, a quiet page promises him back in footnotes. Between the two, the night opens like a slow curtain, and the old hero steps forward again, unhurried, into whatever stage we build next. On screens that glow in darkened rooms, and between pages that whisper when turned, he learns to dress in the fabrics of other centuries, to speak in accents not native to olive groves, and to stand again, larger, shinier, sometimes softer, before eyes that have never smelled Lerna's reeds. Directors light him with the flattering lamps of a world that loves clear victories. Costume shops teach lion skins to become capes that never quite singe. Scripts untangle old knots, so modern hands can rearrange them with tidy bows. In one telling, he smiles too easily and discovers jokes that Greek stone never rehearsed. In another, his grief is sanded down until it fits beneath a PG-13 roof. In yet another, he broods at a cliff's edge because brooding photographs well. The Hydra learns from choreographers how to coil on cue. The Nemean lion remembers to lose on schedule, and Eurystheus, if he appears at all, wears the safe villain's face that draws boos like a kind of applause. Children, wide-eyed in the theatre's cool dim, clutch sugared paper and store away a shape. They will later repaint it, if they are lucky, with quieter colours from books. Between shows, a billboard keeps watch over traffic, promising that strength is a series of explosions that leave tidy, photogenic rubble, the real labour, rerouting rivers and cleaning what generations pretended not to see, rarely survives the trailer. And yet even in the bright simplifications of spectacle, a good line of dialogue occasionally remembers patience. A close-up holds a breath long enough for sorrow to register. A well-placed silence suggests that might and mercy remain cousins who write to each other more often than the box office knows. Animators, who understand that movement is another way to pray, draw his shoulders with care and let the club's curve be modest. Somewhere a storyboard artist adds a small panel of him washing his hands at a stream, and the note "linger here" slips past the machinery intact. On paper, he fares better. Black ink respects twilight. Novelists give him time to listen. They let him sit beside a fire after a labour and taste the way fear leaves the body in stages. They offer Deianira her full share of rooms and light, and Iole a voice that refuses to be diagram. In quiet paragraphs, tutors get to speak more than 3 lines, and a single sentence can carry the entire weight of a remorse without raising its voice. Poets who have always known that a story survives by the rhythm of its breath set him walking again in tercets that feel like footsteps, or in blank verse that leaves space for the club to rest against a knee. Comics split scenes into tight frames, square metopes made of paper, and in their gutters, the unspoken lives, the moment before the blow, the choice to wait, the look exchanged with a companion whose name the myths saved only as a shadow. In libraries, a child trailing a finger along spines finds him under H and then under G for Greek, then on a shelf marked Myths Retold, where covers make solemn promises. The old story, but kinder. The old story, but with the women listening back. The old story, but cleaned of smoke, so it can be read at bedtime without waking particular griefs. Each book adds a small hinge to the long door. Each careful retelling teaches a reader how to hold strength without squeezing it into harm. Music hears him too. Composers give brass the task of his stride, but they let a solo oboe speak when he looks at a quiet lake after killing the birds. Choruses learn the mouthfeel of Heracles and decide to keep the rough K. A lullaby in some village, far from olives, mentions a lion only to arrive at sleep. Painters keep returning to the familiar circle of the Hydra fight because coils and arms make beautiful arguments on canvas. Sculptors carve him resting, and the pause becomes the masterpiece. Even craftsmen who sign no catalogues remember him. A woodworker cuts a toy club for a grandson and sands it until hands will not splinter. A potter stamps a small medallion with a lion head and laughs at how fierce clay pretends to be before the kiln makes it honest. A seamstress stitches a child's costume and chooses a fabric that breathes because she has learned, without reading Sophocles, the danger of garments that cling too eagerly. And then there is the oldest pop culture of all, speech carried on air. In cafes where neon hums like a domesticated lightning bolt, friends tell the story for the 1000th time to someone new. Short, wise, tilted toward the funny bits. In classrooms where the clock insists, teachers rescue the idea of atonement from the cage of punishment and talk about labour as a way to pay debts that money cannot touch. On podcasts that keep company with commuters, a host turns down the music bed and lets the room hear how a man can put down a weapon and still stand tall. Even advertisements borrow him. A company selling soap claims to have rerouted rivers. Another marketing shoes hints that patience is the new speed. It is easy to sigh and sometimes proper, but the borrowing has a secret use. It keeps his name near hands and errands. To hear Hercules while buying bread is to be reminded faintly that work and story still share a wall. Of course, in the bright rooms where news loops itself, he is sometimes misspoken as a synonym for spectacle, his club reduced to a button that summons solutions. Yet at the edges of all this, the older outline persists, a figure who learns, who pays, who repairs what he can and returns what is borrowed. When the night is quiet enough, the pixels dim and the ink goes matte. The toys are asleep in baskets, and the billboard's promise peels slightly in the dew. In that hour, if we listen, we might hear a softer refrain beneath modern thunder, the steady breath that carried a bore without humiliating it, the careful instruction given to water, the apology shaped into service, the hand on a bull's brow, the bowed head before a queen whose belt was a sentence completed without conquest. And as that quieter sound gathers, it prepares us for the next turning of the tale, not the widening, but the deepening, when we will ask what a city inherits from such a life, how politics borrowed his posture, how ordinary ethics stitched his initials into aprons and oaths, how law and mercy learned to stand in the same room without quarrelling. For For there is a legacy beyond posters and popcorn, one that moves more slowly and holds longer. And just ahead, where the streetlights thin and dawn rehearses its first colour, that legacy is waiting to be named. In the slow rooms, where law is written, and the quicker rooms, where it is enforced, his shadow still stands at an angle that makes men adjust their shoulders. City-states borrowed his posture long before they borrowed his name, and rulers, old and new, learned to place a lion's skin over their decrees, sometimes to honour the labour it symbolised, sometimes to hide the teeth they meant to use. In Argive pedigrees and Dorian migrations, Heraclidae becomes more than a genealogical boast. It is a political story that teaches power to pretend it came up the hard way, that it knows the weight of water and the stubbornness of stables. Statues at gateways say as much to citizens as to enemies. Strength lives here, but it is supposed to work, pulling boars into ravines without humiliating them, steering bulls without breaking them, moving rivers through rot rather than declaring the rot inevitable. Oaths spoken in barracks and markets borrow his verbs: protect, reroute, endure, apologise, return. Even the small ethics of everyday life, a shopkeeper weighing figs honestly, a mason squaring the corner he knows no one will see, a ferryman refusing to double charge a widow because late light makes counting tricky, find their small warmth in a tale where might is redeemed by measure. Philosophers who enjoy cleaning language until it holds water keep putting him to use. They ask whether virtue is muscle-bound to reason, whether a good city is one that trains giants to carry, not to crow, whether atonement is punishment or a skilled trade learned under the supervision of necessity. They look at the two tools he carried longest, club and bow, and ask what it means for justice to have both a blunt instrument that keeps wolves at the hedge and a long patience that can work from a distance without glee. They remind students that even a quiver once dipped in poison must be held by a hand that knows when to put it down. In courts where rhetoric likes to sound like thunder, a quieter advocate sometimes invokes him not to terrify but to level the air. Let us speak as if we had cleaned stables this morning, as if our jackets smelled faintly of hay and a river. Let us argue with the humility of someone who has counted cattle at dusk and knows that numbers are honest only when the counting is slow. Priests and civic leaders quarrel amicably over whether his cult belongs in gymnasium or temple, which is another way of asking whether the city's health comes more from exercise or from vows. The answer, carried on evening breezes from both buildings, is that citizens should sweat and promise, should practice both the liturgy of effort and the devotion of restraint. When festivals palm his name like a coin, wrestlers try to win without cruelty. Runners learn the difference between speed and hurry, and poets are asked to praise with exactness. No laurels for easy things, no hymns for victories that were merely loud. Mothers teaching children how to be strong in houses with thin walls, mention him without saying so. Put the heavy basket down softly, return the borrowed thing unchipped. If you open a gate, close it behind you. If you break a gate, mend it better than you found it. Somewhere, a magistrate keeps his temper because he remembers a story in which rage made a house uninhabitable and the only cure was long service. Somewhere, a commander declines a glorious ambush because he has learned, perhaps from the hind, that certain ends are only beautiful when reached by certain means. In darker chambers where policy tastes of iron, his name is misused, of course. Tyrants adore the club, oligarchs admire the lion's skin, demagogues boast of hydras slain while quietly feeding the marsh, and yet even their masks confess the standard, the way counterfeit coins confess the shape of the real. A bored scribe in a provincial office draws a little club in the margin beside a clause that will spare a village 3 visits a year from an official who used to extort fees. He smiles because the clause is small and the village smaller, but the river will run cleaner for it. Craftsmen pass a wooden mallet from father to daughter with a story attached. Not grand, just careful, tap until it fits. And if it does not fit, stop tapping and think. Doctors argue about whether to burn or cut, and someone mentions, half as joke and half as compass, that the hero cauterized not because he loved fire but because he had counted, and counting can domesticate heat. In guild halls, the fable of the Stymphalian clappers becomes a proverb about changing a workshop's noise until the problem flies where it can be solved. In schools, a master asks a sleepy room to tell him which labour shows the most courage, and a child who has watched her mother mop without complaint says, "The stables." And the room learns a better definition of heroism than the syllabus offered. Over time, the legacy hardens into an ethic that does not need capitals. Strength owes service, service owes craft, craft owes mercy, mercy owes truth, and truth, when finally spoken, must be quiet enough to hear water deciding which way to go. Even his end, whether we tell it as flame finding dignity or as cloud finding a passenger, leans politics toward humility, reminding rulers that ceremony is not sovereignty, and reminding citizens that apotheosis, if it exists, is an honour given after wood is stacked square and goodbyes are said without self-pity. And so when twilight gathers around city lamps and laws are read in voices rubbed smooth by repetition, some listeners feel they're breathing a line with an older cadence, and they look toward the dark hills where work was done and think, almost without words, may our power be tired in the right ways by nightfall. Out beyond those hills, the road turns toward the present, where our errands wait under LED skies, our stables spill into plastic and code, our hydras multiply on screens, and still the old grammar holds. And in the soft seam between history and now, a last apple keeps a low light for the traveller who will try, before sleeping, to carry the lesson across the threshold of today. If we bring him forward quietly into our own bright hours, the old grammar still fits the new furniture. Stables become inboxes and overfull rooms in the mind. Hydras hide in multiplying tabs and arguments that grow 2 replies for every one you cut. A boar charges like an emergency that wants you to panic. A hind asks you to wait a year before drawing the bow. A flock of iron birds looks very much like the anxious clatter that keeps sleep from landing. A bull simply needs a steady hand and a rope that is more suggestion than command. The club in this century is not the instrument that wins. It is the permission to be simple when the day tries to be complicated. Turn off one screen, say one careful no. Place one reassuring palm on the brow of something that only needed a calmer heartbeat. The bow is attention stretched without snapping. An email answered with kindness that costs nothing. A sentence revised until it will not wound. A plan held long enough to stay true when applause would prefer a quicker shot. Rivers are still the genius of repair. When a room is foul, change the flow. Let air and time do the heavy lifting. Do not shame the workers who were overwhelmed. Invite them to lay planks and laugh together when the first flood carries what should never have been hoarded. The Amazons remind us that taking is not the same as receiving, and that a belt worn without mirrors is still a crown. The mares teach that appetites can be retaught without spectacle. The birds concede that sometimes you change the room's sound, not the room. Atlas shows us that bearing for a while. What weighs another down is not martyrdom but choreography. Cerberus teaches that even great boundaries can respect a firm embrace and a promise to return what you borrow. And when the tunic burns, when the day that should have been simple goes wrong in a way that will not listen, there is still Weta's craft to learn. Stack the wood square, ask for help without theatre, accept fire as an old, clean function, and trust that what stands on the other side of ending is not applause, but a lightning that leaves the hands empty and strangely willing. None of this makes him less myth. It makes us more human. It asks us to imagine strength as something that goes to market and pays fairly, that bows in the right rooms and stands up in the wrong ones, that carries a friend's weight, and then, when the friend returns, lets go. It asks rulers to smell of hay and river if they would keep our trust. It asks citizens to measure their victories by the quiet they leave behind. It asks children to practice both courage and tidiness, to pick up the heavy end gently, to set the borrowed thing back on its shelf better than they found it. It asks the tired to rest without shame, the angry to count to 4, the clever to reroute a flood rather than inventing a prettier broom. And it asks all of us on nights that seem louder than wisdom to listen for the soft metronome under the noise, the breath that once steadied a lion's cave, the patience that kept an arrow unloosed for a year, the calm that turned a monster's blood into a warning, carried safely. Outside your window, the century hums. Inside this room, a small older music answers it. Somewhere, a janitor turns a key and leaves a museum to its guarded sleep. Somewhere, a shepherd touches a gate and remembers to close it. Somewhere, a nurse rinses her hands and watches water choose the right downward, and she feels a kinship she cannot name with a man in a story who taught rivers to work. And here, now, with the lamp lowered, and night folding its cool cloth over your forehead, the road we have walked together grows soft at the edges. Metopes dim to silhouettes, amphorae cool. The apples keep their private afterglow on a quiet shelf. And the lion's pelt, no longer a boast, only a warmth, becomes a blanket you can imagine drawing up to your chin. Thank you for keeping company through these 20 evenings, through hills and marsh and cities and courts, through rumour and stone and the gentle ledger of evidence. May your own labours tomorrow be steady and unhurried. May your tools fit your hands. May your strength remember kindness, and may sleep come like a ferry on still water, carrying you untroubled toward morning.